Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today we're doing a beef stew, something you've had many times in the past. But this recipe has some interesting 18th century additions. Thanks for joining us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. When I'm looking for dishes, recipes to cook, I want something that everyone can relate to, and everyone can relate to a recipe like this one. But I also want something that's very, very specifically 18th century. This recipe is from The Lady's Assistant by Charlotte Mason. And this recipe book is filled with very, very well-to-do dishes, expensive dishes, and low dishes as well. This one's no different. So let's find this recipe. It's not in the book under beef stew, like we might think. This one has a fancy name. It's called Rump au Ragout. Let's read it here. Cut the meat from the bone, flour it, fry it, pour over it a little boiling water, about a pint of small beer, add a carrot or two, an onion stuck with cloves, some whole peppers, salt, a piece of lemon peel, a bunch of sweet herbs. Let these stew an hour, then add some good gravy. When the meat is tender, take it out, strain the sauce, thicken it with a little flour, add a little celery ready boiled, a little ketchup. Put in the meat, just simmer it up. Or the celery may be omitted, and the ragout enriched by adding mushrooms, fresh or pickled, artichoke bottoms, boiled and quartered, and the hard yolks of eggs. Now, if we read through this, we see underneath it all, it's just a plain old beef stew. Now, we cut up the meat chunks kind of small. You could cook this all in sort of one big piece of meat. Obviously, we don't want the bones. We cut that out of here. But she's added all these things to make it a meal that could go on a fairly well-to-do table. We could show, she makes this fancy here. She adds things like the mushrooms and fresh or pickled, the artichoke bottoms, which is a very interesting addition to this. And it'll definitely change the flavor and the look, and especially the hard yolks of eggs. Those are little garnishes that she's putting on top of something that is basically pretty plain. So it's great that we have basically a very, very simple recipe, something that we would recognize as beef stew, or she fancies it up a bit. Our first step on this recipe is our meat. We're gonna take the meat and cut it into smaller size pieces. The recipe doesn't call for this specifically, but it's gonna cook much easier like this and make a wonderful beef stew. So we're gonna cut these pieces down and then season them. In this case, we only need to season with some salt, and then we're gonna dredge these through some flour and get ready for browning them. So our piece of meat here is a wonderful round that is boneless. Our Dutch oven is all warmed up. We've got some butter already melted in the bottom of the pan. Let's toss in these pieces to brown. While our meat is simmering, let's work on the other components of this recipe. We've got some carrots here that we want for our stew, and we're going to just scrape these real quick to get the outside layer off of them. It doesn't take very long at all. There we go. Now, we're not using a giant Dutch oven here, so we only need a couple of these carrots. We're just gonna cut some rounds for this, and I like my carrots to not get too, I like them to get a little softer, so we're gonna cut them a little bit thinner so they have time to soften up in our stew. And we need an onion with cloves. And this is one of those tricks that you see all over in the 18th century cookbooks. And that has to do with how do you get cloves into this dish and flavor it without them staying in there when you actually want to strain it later on. You don't want these cloves to be there when you're eating the dish. You just want it to flavor it in the beginning parts. So we have our onion and cloves, and we just stick our cloves into our onion here. Now remember, this is a high-end stew, as it were, so we've even got lemon peel in here. It gives lots and lots of complex flavors. We just want that little outer bit of our lemon peel. We don't want to get any of that white pith in there. And I don't know that we need a ton here, but it'll be nice to get a good little bit of peel. We're gonna build a very, very complex dish here, so we're gonna keep adding ingredients. Celery is one of these. Again, on this recipe, she says you can leave that out if you add some of these other ones. We're just gonna add a bit of celery in here. We don't need a lot, but I want a little bit. Celery brings a certain kind of flavor with it and definitely a certain amount of texture with it, which is really the important thing. Now it's time to work on our artichoke. Artichokes can be intimidating and they're a little tricky to get into. If you want an in-depth one, we've done an artichoke episode, you might want to check that out. But let's get this. I think on this one, so what we really want is the core section down here. We're gonna chop off the very top part of this artichoke. We don't want any of this. We can see it's like a giant thistle head. This is the inner part of our thistle, the purple part. We don't want any of that. It's like hairy. We don't want that. And we're also going to cut off the base of this stem. We might want a little bit of the stem. There's still some good stuff in the very, very center of that, but we don't need very much of it. So let's get rid of the first. There we go. So we just have about an inch of the stem here. We want to peel off all these outer leaves. There we go. We just want these tender inner leaves here and just the bottom parts. And I'm going to take my knife and trim this away. Well, actually, let's cut this in half. This will make it a whole lot easier. Let's cut our thing right down the center, from the center of the stem through the center of the piece, and we can really see what's going on there. Check that out. There we go. We can see this sort of a cutaway view, and you can see this inner part that's all hairy. We don't want any of that at all. We're going to cut all that loose, and we're going to trim out the very outside edge too. So our artichoke doesn't look beautiful and white right now. We've used a carbon steel knife, and that causes a problem with something like an artichoke here. It oxidizes, gives us that dark gray look. Doesn't look great. If this was used for a garnish in the top of the dish, I would have a bowl with lemon juice in it, and I'd drop these in and it would keep it from doing that oxidation. In our case, that's not going to matter any, so I'm going to go ahead and not worry about that. I am now going to slice these up into smaller pieces so it can go into our stew and cook down. And here we go. Our artichoke is ready just like that. We'll have a couple of artichokes so we have enough for our stew. It's time to put our vegetables in. The meat is ready. Now it's time for vegetables. We've already got our celery and our carrots cut. I'm gonna put in the artichokes now. And remember, the artichokes in the recipe, those were sort of intended for a garnish later on. In our circumstance, we're not really concerned about that. This is kind of a one-pot dish, so the artichokes need to go in early because they're not gonna be pre-boiled. So they're going in now. So let's put these artichokes in. I've got our lemon peel, and lemon peel just gets put in at this stage too. When I normally think of stews, it's a pretty simple dish. This one's very complicated. It has layers and layers of flavors here. So there are the artichokes. Let's go ahead and put in our peppercorns. So we're gonna sprinkle some peppercorns in there. Let's put in our onion with cloves. And remember, these cloves, they'll come out easy. Later on, we'll take this whole onion out. We're gonna nestle that down in there so that it can cook in the flavor. We don't want that to set up on top. I've got some dried mushrooms instead of fresh. So that they can rehydrate, I'll put them in now. At this stage, we also put in our bundle of sweet herbs. We got a little bit of sage, we got some thyme in here, some parsley. This again will add a bunch of flavor, and we're just gonna tuck this in. And it's in our bundle here so that we can take it out later. Now our liquid ingredients. We've got small beer, a whole pint of small beer that we're gonna pour in at this stage. In the case of the small beer, you can use any beer that you have available to you. And we're gonna top this up with warm water or hot water, even boiling water, she calls it. Again, we wanna get to the top of our ingredients here. Our stew is ready to simmer on the fire. I'm so excited to see what happens with the artichokes. I've never seen one in a stew or a dish like this, so I'm really excited about trying this out. This goes on the fire to simmer for 1 hour. While that's still simmering, we have a little bit of work to do. we've got to put in this final flavor and look to it, and that has to do with egg yolks, which again is an interesting little addition to a stew that I would never put in. We've got some boiled eggs here, and I'm just going to very carefully find that egg yolk. There it is, and pop that right out. There we go, there's our egg yolk. These will go in right at the end. They're already pre-cooked, so they'll look good on the very top. So this is going to really set it off. After our good gravy, a little bit of mushroom ketchup. You can find a link for that down in the description. Finally, it's done. It's ready to try out. The smells are just amazing. And you know what? I like my beef stew thick, and this turned out thick. So let's find out what happens with all these flavors. It's so complex for, you know, a beef stew, right? So here's the beef done to perfection. Cloves come out right up on top. So the question is, what's happening with all this, you know, the broth, the liquid part here? And boy, there's very complex flavors. They're all there, layered together. It's not like there's very many standouts there, but they're definitely, it's very, very rich. And you can even get a little bit of that mushroom ketchup at the very end. So let's find out what really happens with the artichokes. That's the one I really wanted to know. It's artichoke, all right. So artichoke is not adding a whole lot of different flavor here, but we get a different texture. I don't know if it's wasted in this. Maybe as a garnish up on top where you could eat it a little bit separately would make a little bit more sense, but it's definitely something different to put in your stew. A little mushroom, a little egg yolk. I can see why they put the egg yolk in there, especially up on top. This is so good. The food that held up a nation, fish. We don't think about fish the same way they did in the 18th century. We don't think about fish as one of those most important provisions. In the 18th century, it was so very, very important. It would show up regularly on the table of the richest man in the colonies, as well as in the stomach of the very, very poorest. It was so plentiful, anyone could harvest fish from the sea or from the rivers. It would take maybe just a tiny bit of equipment, a hook and a line, or even just a sharpened stick if that's all you had. You could even just dig along the shore of the ocean and get shellfish. It was so important that it would show up in the list of commodities that were being traded. So today in the Midwest, we can turn on certain radio stations and we can hear about, you know, how much beef cattle are selling for, or pork, corn, and wheat, how much that sells for by the bushel. In the 18th century, one of those things was barrels of cod, preserved fish. It was that important. Fresh and preserved fish were important not just to the coast, but to inland portions as well. The rivers were full of fish in the 18th century. There's a wonderful memoir of William Nolan where he talks about his childhood in 1830s backwoods Michigan. And his father built a fish trap. He caught fish, so many fish that they had more than enough for the immediate need. they were able to preserve those fish and survive on them throughout the year when other crops were not available. Today we're going to dive in and take a deeper look into why fish was the food that held up a nation. For the individual or an individual household, fishing could be extremely vital to their household economy, to their very survival. There are times when you might choose to settle in a particular spot just because the fishing was good, even though that might not be the only thing you're going to be doing. Matthew Patton is a perfect example. In his amazing diary where he really goes in depth, he talks about creating this fish trap across a local river with a group of 3 other households. And between them, they harvest shad in the springtime and salmon all through the summer. So in the summertime, every 3 or 4 days, he'll go up to the fish trap and he'll get 2 or 3 or 6 fish, and then he will share those with other people that are his partners in that. And he uses those fish as a means of trade in his local economy. So all the households around him in the town, they're going to be benefiting from that fishing that's going on. So it's really important. We don't think about that today as part of our family income, that we would go out and go fishing specifically so we could trade those within the households around us. So today on the homestead, we are smoking fish, and smoking fish has been done for thousands of years, and people are still smoking fish today. It's great for a situation like the homestead where you may not have access to a great quantity of salt, and it may be difficult to dry your fish. So smoking is a means of preservation. It might not last as long as the other ones, but it gives it a wonderful flavor, and it makes it so your fish can last several weeks instead of several days. And this is a method that also can go along with some of these other methods. So there are times when fish would be partially salted, and then when they got back, they would be processed and they would be smoked. So like a red herring or a smoked herring, that's done that way, where you would kind of salt the fish, and then when it comes back in from the ocean, you would reprocess that and put it in a smoking situation. So the smoking can be done in an individual situation, which perfectly, very easy to do, or it can be done in a very large sort of commercial operation. So smoking was done a lot, and it really imparts a whole different flavor to your fish. Smoking fish does not take incredible equipment. We see here a simple rack made of green twigs, and this is very simple. It would be done by Native Americans as well as settlers in this situation. And you might also have a smokehouse that's specifically made for smoking and use that for fish. You can even hang them up in a chimney in your cabin or in your house. So there's so many different ways you can do the smoking of your fish or other meats too. There's something else going on with smoking that we might not realize, especially today. And in the 18th century, especially with those partially salted fish, those fish are starting to ferment. They're starting to go off, to go bad. And they would use a method like smoking to impart extra flavor to cover up those fermented fish. But at times, that very fermented fish flavor was sought after. So they would set those fish aside so that they would begin to ferment and then bring them in and smoke them to get all that flavor, fermented fish, a little salt, and the smoking all together in one. Very sought after flavors. One of the great things about the smoked fish is that it's edible right out of your package. You don't have to cook it if you don't have the ability to do that. So if you're on the trail in the canoe, it's something that we can eat just like it is. Enjoy it. So very, very good. We do have to be a little careful. Work around those bones. It is a great on-the-go food, especially in a situation like this where we're traveling. We need to have something, but we don't want to take the time to stop and camp. We want to be able to eat right out of our haversack. So, boy, that is great. We're traveling here in the dugout canoes. Makes me think of a story. So, all up and down the east coast of the United States, out in the ocean, you're doing fishing. But the rivers are super important for fishing too. There's a problem though. When you're fishing in the rivers in the 18th century, it's not people with, fishing poles along the side of the river. It's nothing like that. In the 18th century, fishing in the rivers had to do with making fishing weirs and fishing traps. So they would create these funnels in the river out of stones, out of brush, to make the fish all go into one particular spot. And then in that spot, they would have nets or other kinds of fish trap so that they could capture fish 24 hours a day. It was really important to be able to do that. But the rivers in the 18th century, they were also the interstate highways. That's how people are transporting themselves and their goods to market. So they're taking a dugout canoe just like this, and they may have it heaped over with grain, hides, all kinds of things they're taking to market. Fish traps and transportation, they don't go together. So this created a collision between the different people groups there in North America. They took this problem to the government. They said, who gets the rights to work with the river here? Is it about transport or is it about fishing? The government at times sided with transportation, but they had no way to enforce that. They didn't have a way to say, who's in charge of policing the river. So the people took this into their own hands, basically. There's a story about a group of folks who gathered in the upper river section. They came down the river in their dugout canoes, and they started to tear the fish traps apart, take them down so that they could use the river for transport. Well, they were met by another group of fishermen there on the river, and a battle ensued. Let's just say the fish traps won the day that day. Stories like that are the ones that really excite me about digging into history, where we can find out about people, how they interacted with these problems. And those are everyday people, not rich people or people that show up in history books, but the folks that really are battling it out for their very survival. So industrial fishing in the 18th century was just as important to the economy, in fact, probably more important to the economy of North America than industrial fishing is today. Today, and in the 18th century, there's this real big problem. When you're industrially fishing, you are catching thousands and thousands of fish in a day, possibly. And your fish need to be processed because they immediately start to rot. They start to go bad. Today, in the giant industrial fisheries, the fishes are gutted and then they're immediately frozen. That's what we're used to today, aren't we? Frozen fish, we get maybe fresh fish at the market or we get frozen fish. In the 18th century, they didn't have that possibility. There was no frozen, no freezing going on to deliver to customers. So, in the 18th century, the fish were salted so that they could be preserved immediately. So the fish would be gutted and then they would be processed in piles with salt. And if they were going to be out any length of time, they would actually mix those fish with salt, even more salt, and then barrel them up. We might not think about it today, but New England was specifically chosen as a spot for great fisheries. That's one of the reasons why they landed in that location. So they knew about this great fisheries right off the coast of New England because they had been fishing up and down the coast for decades before the Puritans landed at Plymouth Plantation. While ocean fishery was the very, very important part of the economy, river fishing is probably just as important. There are multiple species of kind of fish that would come up from the ocean into the rivers in North America during the 18th century, and they had very, very prolific runs. So it was even easier to catch large quantities of fish as they run up the river, especially in the spring. At Mount Vernon, George Washington carried on a large business in fisheries there on the Potomac River. The shad would run up the river in the springtime, and they would literally catch thousands of shad every day. And these were very large fish. So these fish would immediately have to be preserved. So George Washington purchased many, many barrels of salt just so these fish could be processed at that location, salted down, put into barrels, and sold as pickled shad or salted shad into the market. So it was one of his best cash crops. We've got some great examples of preserved fish right here on the table. Here is a box with salted cod. This cod was caught off the coast of North America and immediately salted, and today we get them in small boxes. In the 18th century, these were put into large 50-gallon barrels of salted cod, and these would be sold into the market in different areas in Europe, in the Caribbean, and along the coast of North America. It's very, very common product being sold to and used by any sort of workmen, sailors, soldiers. And if you don't have a lot of salt, and this takes a tremendous quantity of salt to process salt fish like this, cod and other species can be just dried. This is a difficult process that takes a special time of year and sometimes a special location. So this is a cod that is caught in the wintertime, probably the sort of late winter, and these are processed, gutted on board the ship, and then taken to the shore and put up on racks where they would sort of dry in the wintertime when it's still very cold so that they don't do a lot of decomposing, and then all that moisture is like pulled out of the fish. So it's very, very cold and very, very dry at the same time. And they would have racks and racks of fish like this so that they would be able to process, again, thousands and thousands each season. And stockfish is amazing in its preserved capabilities like this. It's so dry that it really doesn't go bad. If you keep it dry, it'll be good for years in the future. If you only need your fish to be preserved for a week or 2 weeks, one of the very special methods is the potting of fish. And this is a method of cooking the fish, then draining all the liquids off of it, and then sealing that into butter. So it's sort of a very, very primitive canning method of the 18th century. They weren't able to do it under pressure or anything like this, but it would seal that fish off so that it wouldn't continue to deteriorate. And really, all these methods are trying to achieve exactly the same thing. After our fish dies, it immediately starts to decompose. Bacteria start to try to break it down. And what we want to happen is to slow that process down or stop it as much as possible. There are times when we allow that to happen a little bit so that the fish will ferment, and that's all right. And they would like that, some of those flavors. And there are other times that they would try to make that happen, not happen at all, so that the bacteria would be shut down immediately by large quantities of salt, or in this case, cooking. In the research, when you dig into it, it's very interesting to watch what happens and how each culture in different places deal with the situation they have with a particular fish and their availability of salt and what their climate is like. So certain fish you could not dry if you wanted to. The fish would immediately start to rot, but the culture was able to find a particular fish they could do that with. And then there's the idea of salting. Different types of fish need more or less salt. And then there's the idea of why they let the fish go ahead and ferment and then salt it and stop it at a particular kind of flavor. And you can imagine that that probably happened by accident. People weren't able to deal with the fish when they wanted to, and they came back and had to eat it and found out that it had a great flavor if they actually let it, as it were, rot for a little bit before they started doing this preservation method. And today we might look at it and say yuck, but we don't actually know how that was processed. So some people really enjoy the flavor of certain kinds of fish that other people would say was garbage. I think we would be amazed if we went back into the 18th century and saw the things they were throwing away or giving to animals as feed that we would consider great luxuries today. The roe that comes in fish can be very sought after by people, like caviar. And yet in the 18th century, most of that was given to the pigs. There's a wonderful story in Nicholas Creswell's journal from 1774, and he is the son of a fairly well-to-do farmer. And he is going to the New World to seek his fortune. He's going by ship. And while he's on board ship, he's interacting with the sailors and everyone on board ship. It's a fairly small ship, but he sees stockfish being served out, and he relates the whole story because he's never interacted with stockfish, and he's never seen it in his life. So he sees them pounding it with hammers and serving it into some sort of a stew, and he can't imagine actually eating that. He rejects that as food. So as somebody who's from that upper crust, he has never thought of having to eat stockfish in his life. What is he really eating? Well, if he's going to have preserved fish, he's going to have some of this wonderful potted salmon. This is the kind of food that the upper crust would be able to afford and that they would enjoy, and probably the very best way is to serve it on toast. So let's give this wonderful potted salmon a try. It was made a few days ago, spiced nicely. It's wonderful fillet of salmon. Let's find out. There are some really wonderful flavors that come in here. Obviously, we've got some creamy butter flavor. Now, if this was older, we would scrape off the very top layer of butter, but the butter goes with it and mixes everything together here. It brings out some wonderful flavors. We have a chance to spice this nicely, so it's got some salt, some pepper, a little bit of nutmeg, which shows up in all these recipes. And it is really a very superb dish and a wonderful spread on something like this. I can imagine Nicholas Creswell and his well-to-do father sitting beside their fire and snacking on something just like this potted salmon. It's very great. This batch turned out really good. The last batch, again, it's very spreadable, and we added a little bit more spices. I think this one's even better than the first time we made it in our earlier episode. Again, we can see this as a very high-end dish for the 18th century. Nothing like the salt cod or the stockfish or any of these other dishes that were really meant for enslaved Africans, indentured servants, day workers, and soldiers and sailors. Those people are the ones that are really the people that have to feed themselves upon these other sort of less expensive ways of preserving fish. Earlier I mentioned Nicholas Creswell's journal, 1774 through 1777. And not only does Nicholas Cresswell run into stockfish and decide that it's just disgusting, and we surmise that he undoubtedly had eaten potted fish at home in England, but he also deals with other kinds of fishing. So Nicholas Cresswell, he heads into the backcountry. Not many people talk about heading into the backcountry. Luckily, we have this wonderful journal here. This begins probably a week or so after he is already started on his journey into what is now Kentucky. Tuesday, May 30th, 1775. This day, Mr. Norse, Mr. Taylor, and Rice went to take a view of the country. Mr. Johnston and I took a walk about 3 miles from the river, find the land pretty level, a blackish sandy soil, timber chiefly beach. In our absence, those at the camp caught a large catfish which measured 6 inches between the eyes. We supposed it would weigh 40 pounds. I don't expect our company back tonight. So while they're traveling in the backcountry, they have to have all the sorts of provisions they would need. You can't take everything you need, so you're always supplementing that whenever possible with whatever you can get fresh. They shot turkeys, buffalo at times, and in this case, they were fishing. They even found turtle eggs so that they could make bread or pancakes. So very interesting journey. About a month later, he has been into the backcountry, and now it's time to head home. And they are out of provisions. He's really kicking himself that they hadn't stopped and smoked a bison along the way that they had shot. So here he is, Saturday, July 1st, 1775. This morning, John Clifton left us. He intends going home by land. He's behaved very well. Our provisions are almost gone. All our hooks and lines are broken, all our feet so tender by standing continually in the wet that it is impossible for us to hunt, and the small quantity of provision we have is swarming with maggots. Yeah, they're having a rough time of it. They are unable to hunt, and they have lost all their fishing tackle on the way, and they are starving. They do survive. They don't have any problems. Within a couple of days, they land at a place that's civilized enough that they can get supplies. They dig potatoes right out of the ground and eat them raw. Even in this case, they're not always eating fresh. When there were opportunities, they had more meat or fish available to them at one time than they could eat. They would stop and they would smoke it along the way so that they would have something to eat for the next few days. It was incredibly difficult to travel in this situation because there was no means of supply other than what they had brought themselves and what they could catch. So today's fish stew is a perfect example of what you would cook either in a household or maybe on the trail, depending on the supplies that you have with you. This has got green vegetables that have been chopped down and placed in there. We've got some root vegetables. We're gonna let those cook down, and then whatever fish that we have, we might use fresh fish if that's what we've caught today. If we don't have that, we'll go back into our provisions and we'll use salt cod possibly, or even stockfish. And maybe if we've got some spices, we can really bring some flavor out. I think this one's gonna be delicious. Whether a person was an enslaved African, an indentured servant, working class, or a wealthy landowner, fish was one of the most plentiful resources the continent provided. It wasn't only food for your family. Entire industries other than fishing counted on a good catch. Barrel makers, salt workers, shipping and shipbuilding all depended on what came from the sea. Tens of thousands relied upon it for their employment, even their very survival. North America was chosen for its fishing opportunities. The waters were tested for years before Europeans ever settled here. The nation was built upon it. In today's episode of 18th Century Cooking, we are going to be digging into this very popular method of food preservation in the 18th century, and that is called potting. It's something that was done in kitchens in the 18th century all the time. The cookbooks are filled with recipes for potting different sorts of things, generally meats, fish, and sometimes even vegetables. And even though it was done all the time in the 18th century, today we don't use this same method of food preservation. It's been replaced by canning, either canning in an everyday kitchen or sort of industrial canning. So what we're going to end up with today is something very similar to this salmon that has been canned. Now, many of these recipes are specifically for, like, say, salmon or lobster or different sorts of meats. This particular recipe out of Mrs. Fraser's cookbook is just for potting any sort of fish. It says, scrape and clean them well, cut them into middling pieces, season with salt and spices, pack them close up in a potting can with plenty of butter above and below. Tie some folds of coarse paper on the pot, then put them into a slow oven, so not too hot. And when they are enough fired, or cooked in this case, take them out of the can, drain them well from their liquor, let both cool, put the fish into small white pots, skim all the butter off of the liquor, then take some more butter, along with that you take from the liquor, melt it down, pour it on the fish, and then it ends with, this is kind of curious, send in the pots to the table. Now this kind of referenced the idea that this finished thing would basically go right to the table. Generally though, this is a food preservation method, and you'll see some of these recipes say, when you do this, this might last up to a year in its little cooking vessel. Let's get right into the recipe here. We've got a couple pieces of salmon fillets. We're gonna cut this down to the size that's gonna fit into our potting dish. Because of course, we're gonna cook these once and then they're actually gonna go back into our potting dish. So we know kind of the size they need to be. We're gonna salt and pepper these first, cut them in half so that they will fit in this particular pot well. We're gonna butter the inside of it well, and then put in a small layer of butter in the bottom, lay our pieces of salmon on top, a little bit more butter up on top of those, and then this is gonna go in the oven. Most of these recipes actually call for covering this dish in the oven, or how it's being baked, with paper. We're gonna take brown paper, cover our dish, tie that over the top, and that's gonna seal in the flavors and the moisture. We don't want this to dry out. We don't wanna lose those wonderful flavors. In it goes to the oven, and again, she called for a slow oven, so we're gonna bake this at 325 degrees. We're gonna bake this in a Dutch oven. So our potted salmon is in the oven baking right now, and I thought I would talk a little bit more about potting. So again, they potted all sorts of meats and vegetables, and we have done potted beef before, wonderful episode. They would pot brawn, they would pot venison, and even something like poultry. Imagine small birds, they would pot whole. So you would have like a whole woodcock or something, sealed up in your little potting dish. They also potted vegetables and things like mushrooms. Not only that, but they potted butter itself. I'm not sure exactly how you pot butter. Maybe you pack it in there and then you pour clarified butter on top and you hope it doesn't melt it. I don't know exactly how potted butter worked, but they certainly potted butter. Now, where did this come from? Now, generally it's thought that they used crusts, like big pie crusts, to do a meat preservation method. And we've covered that also in the past. They would take the top off of these pies after they bake them, pour clarified butter in them and set that top back on and save that back for later. It might last up to a month. I think there was then a evolution where the crust disappears and is just replaced by this potting dish. So it kind of saved a bunch of effort and shortcut the whole system. So you generally see this potting method showing up in the very early 17th century, and by the 18th century, it is a very popular method. In the 18th century, one of the most common things that you would find, that you would be able to buy in the store, is potted char, which is a special kind of freshwater fish that was available in England at the time. And I've got this wonderful reference. It is from 1738, so it's a fairly early reference. And this is the Duke of Montague, and he is writing a Mr. Atkinson. He says that I received yours of the first of this month, your package, and also the pot of char, which you sent by that day's courier, which was the best I ever ate. And I would have you send me some of the same sort by every carrier. Take care to pick the hen fish and those that are of the red kind, and let them be potted and seasoned just as that pot was, for it can't be better. That's what the Duke of Montague thought about potted char in the 18th century. Let's take our salmon out of the oven. Our salmon has been in this Dutch oven for 35 minutes. We need to take this out of the Dutch oven. We want to be very careful though, because we have liquid butter right at the top, so it's got to stay level. Now we're going to take the salmon out carefully. We've let this cool so I can get in there with my fingers, because it might want to break up. We want to keep these into fairly large pieces. We're going to take this out of our dish, set it aside on a plate to cool. We're going to recover this butter. We're not going to just throw this out. We're going to leave the drippings down in the bottom. That's the part we want to leave behind, because that's the preservation part. This is the part that will go bad. So we're going to leave all those solids down in the bottom of that and pour off our liquid butter, our clarified butter in this case, and pour that into our pipkin of butter that we are clarifying so that we can top this up. We're going to seal the top with butter. And real quick, let's talk about clarifying butter here. To have this be preserved, for this butter to stay good at room temperature, we need to remove all the milk solids and all the water from our butter. So clarifying it, we melt that butter and all these milk solids will fall to the bottom. That's the part that goes bad on butter, that part that goes rancid. If any sort of froth floats to the top, we don't want that either. What we want is that nice golden oil. That's the good part. That's what's going to stay good at room temperature for a long time. Our salmon has sat overnight. The clarified butter totally solidified. It's pretty cool here in the kitchen. So nice and hard. I peeled off a section of it so we can get to the meat that's down underneath so we can try it out. So let's find out just how this salmon turned out. so moist and creamy, set up in this way. Still have that wonderful salmon flavor. You know, there's that little bit of salt and pepper, and we could have spiced it a little bit more. The recipes call for different kinds of spicing here, and this spice is part of the preservation that's going on with this. But we still have just amazing flavor, and the texture is perfect when it's sort of sealed up in this manner. Just so good. And I mean, all that butter there doesn't hurt it at all. This is a really interesting dish because of its texture and the different kind of ways you can use it. This is so creamy, as I was saying earlier, that you could easily spread it on a piece of bread or on crackers or something like that, which they would have done in the 18th century. This is something that was eaten cool or cold. It's like a snack or a special part of the meal where you're looking for something different. You've had, you've already had the main dish and you want this little finish dish that you can just kind of peck on, or something that you would just kind of dip into at a different part of the day. So you might eat on this all day long, just sort of snack on it. Really, really interesting dish. One of the things that shows up in many of these potted dishes is the texture. Whether if it's a meat that has a much tougher texture, like potted beef, then that's ground till it's very, very soft, like a pate. The fish here has a natural tendency to get soft like that, so we didn't have to pound it up. And then there are some other dishes, like potted lamprey, that are almost gelatinous when they're done. So everything is supposed to be this sort of almost spreadable form. This is a perfect example of something that you would read in a cookbook and you can't really understand it. You don't really know what's going on with it. It doesn't really explain itself until you actually get a chance to do it. That's what's fun here with this 18th century cooking, is we get to experience it, cook those things up, and then taste them. Such an interesting experiment. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today we're doing the quintessential Christmas dessert of the 18th century. Yeah, plum pudding. You've heard of it, and it's going to be great. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So we don't think too much about plum pudding today, except in these strange literary references. But in the 18th century, it was referenced hundreds and hundreds of times. It's a very, very popular dessert in England and in North America in our time frame. One of the most common references that we are used to is in Dickens's A Christmas Carol. And here's a section. This is Mrs. Cratchit. In a half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed, but smiling proudly with the pudding, like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in a half a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly stuck in the top. Yes, plum pudding was a Christmas dessert, as well as just a standard dessert that was common, but very, very particularly for Christmas. Now, what does it mean by a plum pudding? What are the plums in a plum pudding? Well, plums aren't the plum from a plum tree, but they are raisins. Here's Johnson's dictionary from 1809. He says a plum, it's either a fruit or dried grapes or 100,000 pounds. Well, dried grapes are what they mean by plums in a plum pudding. A plum can really just mean sort of anything sweet, and raisins were used as a sweet in the 18th century. So that's the plum in our plum pudding. So I dug through all the cookbooks, and there were many, many recipes. I picked out the one from the London Art of Cookery by Farley because it's the simplest and it's got some good instructions here. A plum pudding boiled. Cut a pound of suet into little pieces, but not too fine. A pound of currants washed clean. A pound of raisins stoned. 8 yolks of eggs and 4 whites. Half of a nutmeg grated. A teaspoonful of beaten ginger. A pound of flour. And a pint of milk. Beat the eggs first, then put them in half the milk and beat them together, and by degrees stir in the flour. Then the suet, the spice, the fruit, and as much milk as will mix it well together, very thick. It will take 5 hours boiling. We're gonna take a page out of a couple of other recipes to make this one a bit more festive with a few extra ingredients. We don't want to boil our pudding for 5 hours, so we're going to make a smaller version. We're going to go with a 1/3 size. So basically 6 ounces of all the main ingredients, and then we add in the spices and whatnot. So let's start off just like the recipe did. I'm not going to do the special thing with the eggs because we only have 3 eggs in this. So rather than do something like 2 whole eggs and 1 yolk, we're just gonna put 3 eggs in there. Let's not complicate it. On a recipe like this, it's not gonna make that much difference. So 3 whole eggs. Our eggs are whisked up. I'm gonna add, it says add in half the milk. So we don't wanna go crazy with our milk. We will use that milk, this extra milk later on to bring our consistency up. If it's too thick, we can add some of that extra milk and get where we need to go. One of our additional ingredients, which you do not have to include. Again, this is very, very additional. As a Christmas pudding, many of the recipes have a little bit of brandy put in. So I'm gonna go ahead and put in a touch of brandy. So let's start adding some of these ingredients to it. I'm gonna start off with our flour. Again, I'm not gonna add it all at once because I don't want it to get all lumpy. Starting to really thicken up. Let's put our sweetmeats in. And you heard raisins and currants. And the currants in here, there are 2 kinds of currants. The currants come off of a currant bush, or again, currants are just little tiny raisins. And we're gonna be using those type. That's what's typically meant in these recipes. And I've got, this seems like a lot, doesn't it? Yep, we're gonna put them all in there. Boop. All those currants in there. Now, the raisins, and again, we've got 6 ounces of raisins along with 6 ounces of currants. That's a lot of raisins. There we go. I'm gonna go ahead and add our spices in now. Again, before it gets too thick, to mix it well. Half a teaspoon of ginger, powdered ginger. And it called for, in that recipe, a whole half of a nutmeg. Of course, this is a 1/3 recipe, so we don't need a whole half of a nutmeg in this. But I mean, could you go wrong? Let's start to fold in our suet. Suet is one of those special things. To make a proper boiled pudding like this, you've got to have suet. And it's not something that we typically have in our supermarkets here in North America. This is not just regular muscle fat, but it's kidney fat. It's this very, very waxy fat, and it has a very high melting temperature. So what happens here is we put it in, and it is mixed all throughout this mixture, and as it boils, it liquefies and creates little holes. It gives it a sort of a fluffy quality, if you can call it that. So in it goes, and it needs to be kind of in little bits. It can't be in these great big blobs. I kind of cut it so that it's very frayable and can break up into our pudding into little pieces all over. Okay, our consistency is still looking really good. It's now this is a Christmas one, and we can add some extra of colorful sweetmeats to it. So I've got some candied orange peel. I'm not gonna have to put a bunch of that in there. We've got plenty of sweets in here already. There's some candied lemon peel. And if you want something very, very colorful in there, something like candied cherries. Again, they had all these sort of sweetmeats in the time period, and it would be something that went into a fancy pudding. So we've got a nice homogeneous mix here. And the consistency is pretty thick, but I'm gonna continue to add just a little bit of flour until it gets a bit more thick. And really the issue has to do with, as that boils, you don't want the individual components, especially the raisins, to all sink down to the bottom, and then it won't look right. It needs to be, the consistency needs to be over the whole piece, so we need it to be, that's why they call for a stiff mixture when it's done. This mix is perfect right now. It's very colorful and it smells great. It's gonna go in and I can't wait to see how it's gonna look when it comes out. Now it's time to get it ready to go into the pudding cloth. So our pudding cloth is an essential piece of equipment in making this particular dish, and we have to prepare it. We have to get it ready. And so what we're going to do is take our pudding cloth. Now, when I say a pudding cloth, I mean a finely woven, fairly thin piece of cloth like muslin, not cheesecloth. That will not work. Don't use cheesecloth. We're going to take a nice piece here. This is 18 inches square. I'm gonna dunk it in my boiling water just for a second and then take it out. And now we're gonna set it out in this fairly large bowl and flour that. So we're gonna spread flour all over the interior of that. That'll help the pudding stay together and not seep through the pores of the cloth. That's why we don't wanna use cheesecloth, because the pudding will just basically dissolve right through the cheesecloth. So don't use that. And then we bring this up semi-tight and tie it off with a string. We want it to be a fairly strong string. We don't want that to break. Now this will probably grow a little bit as it boils. It'll get tight, but that will make a nice round shape, and that's what we're looking for. We don't want it so tight though that it bursts its cloth. There are people talking about that in the 18th century. Oh no, my pudding cloth burst and it ruined my pudding. We don't want that. And once that's all tied up, it's ready to go into our boiling water. Now this one won't have to take 5 hours. This one, this third size, about 2.5 hours. So it's boiling away. You want to make sure the water's boiling the whole time. Now I did a bunch of research on this particular dish because it's just so important. And I found it very, very interesting that it shows up over the entire social spectrum. This is a description from about a poorhouse in 1724 in England. It goes through the house and the people that are in it and the work that they have to do, and also their entire diet. It has the whole menu here. But at the end of this menu, it says, bread and beer were allowed to all without limitation. They have roast beef at the 3 great festivals and plum pudding at Christmas. So even in the poorhouse, the poorest of the poor here are being fed plum pudding at Christmas. So here it is on the poorest table possible, and yet in 1711 we have William Byrd III's diary, and he's in Virginia, and he writes about having plum pudding for dessert. He has puddings all the time. And this is a very, very well-to-do man, and he's having puddings. Is very, very common dish, even in Virginia in the early 18th century. Now, what about other situations? Say Revolutionary War America. There's a great reading from Thomas Anbury's journal, and he talks about traveling as a prisoner of war officer in 1778, and he's staying in different kind of houses as they travel from one spot to another. And here he's talking about his host. He says, he is engaged for some time past among his friends and relations. He would stay at home and entertain us an excellent Christmas dinner, not even forgetting the plum pudding. So here is Revolutionary War America, and there's somebody having a Christmas dinner, and there it is, plum pudding all over again. It's showing up all over these amazing places, and not just in the 18th century, but in the 19th century, like the Christmas Carol, or even before that. A voyage to Virginia, 1649. The feast of Christmas came upon us, which we began with a very melancholy solemnity. And yet, to make some distinction of the times, the scrapings of the meal tubs were all massed together to compose a pudding, Malaga sack, sea water, with fruit and spice, all well fried in oil, were the ingredients of this regale, which raised some envy in the spectators, but allowing some privilege to the captain's mess. We met no obstruction, but did peaceably enjoy our Christmas pudding. 1649. Even aboard ship, when they had no rations left, on Christmas, they tried to put together a Christmas pudding. That's how important this particular dish is to this time of year. This one's ready to eat. Let's just see how it turned out. Now, I put a pudding sauce on top of this. Many of the recipes call for a simple pudding sauce, butter, sugar, wine, or something like this, butter, sugar, and brandy. The wine turns out great, or just plain butter and sugar. It's got so many different interesting flavors going on in this. You know, the raisins for their sweetness. But raisins bring in a lot more flavor than just sugar, which we might, use today. It's got a lot of savoriness to it also. All that suet, while you might think, yuck, that's got this weird, fat flavor to it. It doesn't. It brings in this wonderful savoriness to this, along with the sweetness. So it's a real complex kind of dessert compared to what kind of we're used to today, just sugar on top and nothing else. So there's a whole bunch to this, and we get to choose also as we make our pudding sauce as to just how sweet this gets. We can make it a real sugary sauce, and we can use a lot of it, or we can make it a very buttery sauce with just a little bit of sugar, and wow, it really brings out all these flavors, and we get all this sweetness, and it's very moist, very, very moist. It's really something that should come back into popularity because it is just so good and so Christmas. If you have never had a boiled pudding before, and this is not the easiest technique in the world, but it really is something you need to try out. And this is the perfect time of year for it. When we need to take a little extra time for the holidays, we need to take extra time cooking a special dish. This is one of those things. It is so quintessentially Christmas, and it is the perfect thing for you to try out this time of year. I hope you have a very Merry Christmas, and thanks for watching. There is a great problem with people being put out of work because of the Industrial Revolution. All kinds of industries are collapsing, driving people out of the country into the cities to get whatever jobs they can. That is not working well for families. It's not working well for society in general, even in North America. Welcome to this very special episode of 18th Century Cooking. Today we're going to be talking about the poor and how to feed the poor in this time period of the 18th century, and specifically the 1790s and about 1800. In this time period, there is a real problem with supplying just normal people with bread. There's a crop failure in the late 1790s in Great Britain, and there's a great problem with feeding just everyday common people on the street. There are bread riots, there are all sorts of things, and there's a desire within all of the society to fix this problem, and many people wrote about it. We have this wonderful little piece from Hannah More, and she writes this small little pamphlet-y book called The Cottage Cook. So Ryan's been cooking up this soup out of this book. Let me read to you the recipe. So you think that this book is actually a cookbook. Now, it does have recipes in it, but it's only got like 4 recipes, and they're all almost the same thing. Let me read to you recipe number 3. That's the one we're making today. Take 2 pounds of salt beef or pork, cut it into very small bits, and put it into a pot with 6 quarts of water, and let it boil on a slow fire for 3/4 of an hour, and then put a few carrots, parsnips or turnips, all cut small, or a few potatoes sliced, a cabbage, or a couple of cresses. Thicken the whole with a pint of oatmeal, all of these to be well seasoned with salt and pepper. the other recipes are actually almost exactly the same thing in this cookbook. And this type of recipe is mentioned over and over in this time period. Why? There's no bread in this. There's no grain that needs to be given to this particular situation. The poor in the late 18th century, they survived on bread and small beer. That's it. And there was this, since wheat was so expensive, they had to come up with other means. And these people in the upper parts of society said, how can we help the poor people eat? How can we give them different options for eating bread? There were other options for bread specifically, and they talked about these in a time period, making bread with other things than wheat. Making bread with rye, making bread with oats or barley, or even peas and beans. Making bread that was not very good, even distasteful. And the common people rejected that bread. They did not want to eat it. They wanted to eat white bread. So let's set the stage for what's happening in the late 18th century in Great Britain. There is a great problem with the Industrial Revolution is basically coming into this time period, and a lot of people are being thrown out of work. A lot of cottage industries like weaving and spinning are being taken up by machines, and people are leaving the countryside and they are going to the cities. And there's a great increase in low-income people in these urban situations. And then we have on top of that all these crop failures and other problems. So there's a great amount of stress on lower income people here in Great Britain and even in North America in this time period. There's also a great desire to have people not cook their food the wrong way. So even during the Revolutionary War and in this time period, there's a desire that if people get meat, they should not roast it. They shouldn't fry it on the fire, but in fact, make soup with it because it's the most efficient way to get the most nutrition out of a piece of meat. So this is from The Soldier's Friend. And this is a little pamphlet right here from the time period, 1798. And it's for officers to help their military soldiers under their command eat properly and many other things. He says, nothing is so agreeable and at the same time so wholesome to a soldier after a fatiguing and perhaps a wet march as some warm soup. To boil the meat is therefore the mode of cooking which ought to be the most generally used in the army. There's even almost commands from the upper parts of the military down to the lower officers telling them to not let their soldiers fry the meat, that you should only give them the equipment so that they can boil the meat or they can make soups and stews because it's the most efficient way to feed these soldiers. In this late 18th century time period, there's also the creation of soup kitchens, or as they call them in this book, soup shops, that are popping up in London, and they want to be able to feed poor people. They don't necessarily give away the soup, they charge a small amount for it, and the amount that isn't covered by what they're charged is actually covered by a subscription by other people in that community. But they're reaching out. They want to feed as many people as possible. We've got this wonderful recipe for this soup kitchen in Birmingham. This is outside of London, obviously. 80 pounds of beef, shoulder, bosom, sticking pieces with 3 oxes' melts or lungs, given in by the butchers and weighing about 16 pounds. So something like 96 pounds of meat. Also, 4 legs of beef weighing 34 pounds, 3 ox cheeks weighing 27 pounds, and then added to that, 37 quarts of white peas, 21 pounds of onions, 48 pounds of ground rice, 12 pounds of salt, 6 ounces of black pepper, 2 ounces of ground ginger, and just a ½ ounce of cayenne pepper. Also, mint, celery, carrots, or leeks are often given as presents to sort of fill out this. Now, they would make these huge batches. This batch here would make 160 gallons of soup, and they go through and give you exactly what it would cost to make this 160 pounds or 160 gallons of soup. Even a recipe like this, isn't it interesting that in 160 gallons, they still put in the spices like a ½ ounce of cayenne. They want these, they still want there to be some flavor in this basically very inexpensive watery soup. And they would sell, or somebody would sort of buy a subscription to this for a small amount. Each week, each day, they could come in and get, say, a ½ gallon of soup and feed their entire family. Maybe there would be some liquid allowance to this too, either small beer or something like it, and possibly a small loaf of bread. And so in the cities, people could still eat well, even for a very small amount of money. A great example of someone in this time period is the author of this cottage cook, which is Hannah More. And she's writing hundreds of small pamphlets, helping out people with different ideas. Sometimes they're moralistic teachings, sometimes they have a religious bent to them, but she has a real heart for what's happening with these people in the lower part of society. She really wants to help them out as best she can. And the whole beginning part of this is a little story about a woman who didn't feel like she had enough money to really help out people. And Hannah More kind of goes through the steps of what somebody can do, even if they don't have a lot of funds. They can really help people out by teaching them how to cook or teaching them other things. So there's a lot going on in this time period. The people in the upper parts of society aren't necessarily saying, oh, poor people, there's nothing we can do about it. They definitely want to reach down and help out the poorer parts of society right here in the late 18th century. Definitely probably a change from what was happening earlier on in the 18th century. So let me read to you this little section from The Cottage Cook, or Showing the Way to Do Much with Little Money, right here at the end of the main story. She's talking to someone and she says, "You have taught me that much good may be done with a little money, and that the heart and the head and the hands are of some use as well as the purse." So there's Mrs. Jones in this story, learning about what she can do. And again, you can almost connect right back with the Christmas Carol and Scrooge. There was Scrooge, and he was very, very well-to-do. He wasn't really doing anything with his money, but he had a lot of money. People came to him and said, "Hey, how can you help out the poor?" And he asks immediately, what about the workhouses? What about the poorhouses? Aren't they doing the right thing? And here in this book, they're definitely saying, how can we help out the poor without sending them to those very places? The poorhouse, the workhouse in the late 18th century England were very, very difficult places. They made them that way on purpose. They didn't want people to stay there. They didn't want people to live in the poorhouse forever. And so they made it a very, very dismal existence. These works are meant to keep people out of those very places. How can we help out the poor? So here it is, the soup right out of The Cottage Cook. Ryan, what did you think about the recipe?
It's really straightforward. It's really simple. There were a lot of root vegetables that you could use, and I just decided to use them all because we have them all.
A little bit of everything.
Yeah, right.
Also, I think the special thing is the oatmeal that comes in at the end.
Right.
That thickens it
right
up. Right.
Yep.
I wouldn't complain about this.
No.
Anytime.
It's interesting. The texture is almost like when you thicken something with flour.
Right. The oatmeal does an excellent job of thickening this up so that it isn't a super thin soup.
Right.
One of the references actually complained, I think it was the College of Physicians.
Okay.
They were saying, a liquid food doesn't work in your stomach. They said, the stomach acids turn it into solids, and only then can you digest it, which now, of course, we think is pretty silly.
Yes.
But this thickening of the soup was an important part of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely hearty. There's a lot going on in here. So it's got carrots, it's got turnips. I think the parsnips really come through, that sweetness from the parsnips.
Yeah.
And then there's really only, I mean, compared to everything else, there's only a little bit of meat.
True.
But you cut it small enough that it, it fills it out.
Yeah, that's the whole idea of cut it really small.
Right.
In that particular recipe, it talked about salt beef. You used fresh beef, which is fine, but salt beef would have been an inexpensive meat that they could have gotten any time of the year.
I think when you cut the cabbage up really small, that really helps to fill it up too. You never have a bite that feels empty or brothy, right? There's always something there.
But it's not all greens. You have this, if you have the big pieces of greens in there, it's hard to work around. But in this way, it fills it up. It gives you the nutrition of the greens without the troublesome big leaves in there.
Plus the greens, you really don't, it's not like a beef broth. This is like a vegetable, it tastes like a vegetable broth. There's enough cabbage and the parsnips and the carrots really coming through. And then there's body from the potatoes. It's just good overall.
So I read that giant recipe from the soup kitchen one, right? With the 80 pounds. Their instructions were to actually cook those meats in a digester or pressure cooker so that it turned everything into a broth. I am so glad we tried this recipe. It has an amazingly rich history, an important history. Let me read to you the final paragraphs from The Cottage Cook. This is the friendly hints at the very end. The difference between eating bread new and stale is 1 loaf in 5. If you turn your meat into broth, it will go much further than if you roast it or bake it. If you have a garden, make the most of it. A bit of a leek or an onion makes all dishes savory at small expense. If the money spent on fresh butter were spent on meat, poor families would be much better fed than they are. If money spent on tea were spent on home-brewed beer, the wife would be better fed, the husband better pleased, and both would be healthier. Keep a little Scotch barley, rice, dried peas, and oatmeal in the house. They are all cheap and don't spoil. Keep also pepper and ginger. Pay your debts, serve God, love your neighbor. The end. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. We have a special guest in the kitchen today, Michael Dragoo, and he's brought, what dishes you brought?
Stewed crabs.
That looks delicious. Thank you so much, Michael. Thanks for joining us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. What strange variety of food in this wide world we meet. The fields, the forests, and the flood afford a bounteous treat. Nature her generous lap unfolds to those who earn their living. Old ocean not a crab withholds. To all a part is given. Today we're going to be cooking seafood, and specifically crabs. That's such an important part of the diet in the 18th century for anyone that was along the seacoast. All up and down the eastern seaboard of North America and in Great Britain, seafood and shellfish were so important to the diet of poor people and rich people alike, but actually very, very important to poor people. Today we consider seafood to be something maybe that's fairly expensive. It's in great demand, whether you are in the coasts or in inland, and we tend to pay a lot of money for it. In the 18th century, it was so prolific on the seaboard that it tended to be food for the poor. So you will find it being sold as street food, vendors going along the street and selling it in New York, in Philadelphia, in London, anywhere along the coast. And it's also being used for more expensive food. But generally, you'll find that it was really kind of looked down upon because poor people would eat it. There are even circumstances where people would say, oh, if there are, say, lobster shells outside someone's house, that means they're very, very poor people. We don't think about that today, do we? So we can imagine ourselves walking down the street, say in Manhattan today, and we might stop by and get a hot dog from a hot dog vendor. But in the 18th century, It might be a vendor with oyster on the half shell, and you just eat it right there. And there is more than one reference to either prisoners or indentured servants complaining about having to eat, say, lobsters more than 3 times a week. They would petition whoever's in charge and say, you can't feed us that more than 3 times a week. And so poor people, many times, if they felt that they were in very good circumstances if they didn't have to rely upon these inexpensive shellfish to feed themselves, get that protein each and every week. The most important part for me on these recipes is setting the context, setting the stage for what this food means in the time period and what it means to us today. I hope you enjoy this very interesting crab recipe. So today's dish, it includes crab, a seafood, and many times we think of seafood as fairly high-end kind of food. Sometimes it's very regional. It can be expensive. We can all get it at the grocery store, but it's all, it might be frozen or an expensive fresh dish. In the 18th century, that wasn't necessarily true.
No, this recipe comes from the early 1700s, and we're still pretty much living on the eastern seaboard. Shellfish is not a high-end fish, but it's an easily obtained fish. And not everyone was raising hoofed creatures, and you had to live, and you could barter if you had the wherewithal.
Well, something like crabs, clams, mussels, all those things are they're easy to get. They're cheap food in the time period. Very prolific. They had a lot of seafood in the market. So this is really it can be a very low-end dish. Today we don't think of it that way because it's very expensive.
No, but when we did that lobster recipe, we had people write in that they remembered their grandparents being ashamed, that the kids would be ashamed because they had a lobster sandwich in their lunchbox at work. It never has been a high-end until rather recently in our, in our frame of mind.
So it's much more expensive for us to get in the time period. This could have been a very inexpensive dish.
It is. It's very few ingredients, but they're ingredients that you wouldn't necessarily choose today to prepare it, and I think it's going to be an interesting take on this. To stew crabs comes from Powell's Complete Book of Cookery, and it reads as follows. Take out the meat and cleanse it from the skins, put it into a stew pan with 1/4 pint of white wine, some crumbs of white bread, an anchovy, and a little nutmeg. Set them over a gentle charcoal fire with the yolk of an egg beat into it, some pepper, and stir it all together and serve it up. That's it. It's as simple as it is. What excited me about this was the cookbook itself. Powell is my wife's maiden name, and they both are from England, and we're researching that connection right now. This is a simple recipe using crab. Not everybody cooks with crab every day. It's affordable. I'm excited to try this. Let's get started. Our ingredients include an egg yolk, breadcrumbs, some black pepper, a minced anchovy, and the crab.
Right, and we got some white wine. So you're going to start off with a mixture of this white wine, and you're going to bring the egg in, right? Yeah,
but if I were to introduce the egg yolk into the pan, it calls for about 1/2 cup.
Okay.
And that's about 1/2 cup. And if I were to introduce that egg yolk as the preparation is warming, it'd turn into a scrambled egg, and we don't want that. Alrighty, if you want to add the breadcrumbs and a pinch of black pepper.
So, like usual, these recipes, they don't say how much breadcrumbs to put in. I think they just want a slight thickening, so we're going to go with that. You want black pepper in here too now?
Yep.
Okay, here's our black pepper.
Whoa.
I like black pepper, so we're going to load it up.
And then I can't come here anymore without having the nutmeg, so we've got a pinch of nutmeg.
This is in the recipe, right?
Yes, it is.
There it is. See, we're not cheating. This has really got nutmeg in it.
That's
about
enough.
1/2 nutmeg?
I think that's more than
about
enough.
A little bit more?
I'm stopping. Thank you.
Okay.
Alrighty, then we're just going to mix the crab in with this.
Okay.
I'm going to pour this in here, and we'll just mix it up.
There we go.
And then our last bit is just pouring it all together.
So this mixture, it looks great. It looks like we could eat it right now, but obviously it needs to go on the fire, right?
Gentle charcoal fire in the skillet. Right, we just had this thing simmering on the fire and we've taken it out. And it's time to give it a test drive here.
Okay, I've done well over 300 cooking episodes and I've liked almost every single one of them. Question is this the one that breaks the rule because it just doesn't look.
Might be the one.
It doesn't look good.
Are we together? Are we doing this together?
Okay, let's go. Okay.
Well,
I'm not sure what's in here, Michael. No,
it needs to be a little brighter taste. I don't know what
Brighter.
I'd add a little salt, but it didn't call for it. Maybe another anchovy. That's
don't
we get
know.
the saltiness.
I think the anchovy's the thing that's in here that I don't like.
Yeah.
I don't know.
You know, I had a second spoonful. Haven't dropped dead yet.
You want to try this? You want to try
Ryan,
this?
yeah.
I'm not.
It's really not
does
that
not look
good. I don't know if our cat would eat it or not. Just try it. You were such a baby.
Oh my God. What is that?
Well, it's
This was just
that
foul.
Minnesota.
Yeah.
That is foul.
This is a first for 18th century cooking.
Yeah.
We have never had a recipe fail as bad as this one has. And you know, it's not, the crab was good, everything, it should have been right, but something just is not right about this.
Something's not working with something. It's,
No, but you know what? That's what 18th century cooking is all about. That's why we dig into the cookbooks and try to figure these things out. Sometimes we get the recipe wrong. Maybe we got the recipe wrong. Maybe there's something that we got, or maybe their just taste buds were different than ours.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is, but this is, well, he said it, foul. It just does not work.
No.
But again, this is a learning experience, so thank you, Michael, for bringing this wonderful learning experience. Very interesting recipe.
Still number one.
If you know what I mean. Yeah. Thanks for coming along on this journey as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. In today's episode, we'll be cooking and eating mushrooms from the woods. If you find mushrooms, but you can't 100% identify them as edible, do not eat them. The forest this time of year in the spring, it's amazing. It's beautiful. It's glorious. And there's nothing more wondrous than the morel mushroom. Morel mushrooms have a long tradition in my family. And right now, we're in the middle. In fact, we're at peak morel mushroom season. And here they are. These things are glorious. They're wonderful. And my family's been, picking them, hunting them. Really, you don't pick them, you hunt mushrooms. It's funny that my wife's family, the side of the family that's from this area in the Midwest, had a long tradition of looking for morel mushrooms, and yet my wife's mother's family was from out east. They thought they were deadly poison, couldn't believe anybody would eat these things. My question when I find them today, and I want to eat them, but I connect them with the 18th century and I say, now wait a minute, did they have morel mushrooms in the 18th century? Did they want to eat them as much as I do? Well, if you dig in the 18th century English cookbooks, you will find morel mushrooms. And I do believe they're exactly the same kind of morel mushrooms that we have here today. The range for morel mushrooms is over most of the North American continent. You'll also find them in Western Europe, including Great Britain, even places in China, Japan, and New Zealand, you'll find morel mushrooms. Now, these English recipes, I am not going to use one of the 18th century English recipes that you will usually find morel mushrooms referenced in, because they are sacrilegious. They're terrible because they put these morel mushrooms in with all sorts of other flavors and have them as a tiny component inside of a big expensive dish, like a fish pie or something else. That is terrible. You do not want to do that with morel mushrooms. So I did a little bit more digging. And I said, well, I mean, truly the only way to cook a morel mushroom is to fry it, and you eat it by itself. In fact, you don't need anything else, really. You can just make a meal of morel mushrooms if you ask me. So I went digging for fried mushrooms, and yes, Primitive Cookery has the perfect fried mushroom recipe. That's what we're going to do today. These things are the best. Don't ruin it by cooking them any other way. In the cookbook, Primitive Cookery, 1767, it's a great little cookbook. To fry mushrooms, toss up your mushrooms with a little broth to take away their bitterness. Then strew over them salt, pepper, and flour, and fry them in butter or hog's lard. This is kind of funny. It says to fry mushrooms. If you're here in Indiana and someone says, do you want to eat mushrooms? They mean morels. That's what mushrooms are in Indiana. Any of those other things that grow out in the funguses, those aren't mushrooms. Morels are mushrooms. When possible, we want to eat these mushrooms fresh the same day they are picked. These are beautiful, fresh. Some of them picked last evening and this morning. These are ready to go. The preparation is very, very simple. I've already trimmed off most of the dirt. If we had a little bit of dirt, and usually I try to get the maximum mushroom out of the ground, so I'll bring some up with the dirt and very, very carefully take off the root part of our mushroom, and occasionally they will have little problems with them that we might need to trim off. And this one is looking great. So we're going to take our mushrooms and we are going to slice them in half so that we can cook them all the way. These are hollow, and so one of the ways you can tell whether you have a real morel. There are false morel mushrooms and they are poisonous. If it's hollow, that's good. If they have any sort of internal section to them, you probably have a bad mushroom and you don't want to eat that. And you don't want to eat a bad mushroom because they're poison. We're going to place these in our beef broth. If you don't have beef broth, a simple salt water solution is fine for these. They'll absorb a little bit of that beef flavor. That's going to be great. If not, salt water's good too. Some people manage to freeze them. Boy. If you've got enough at all, you really just want to cook them right away and look for any sort of little crud or dirt. The worst part is when you come along and you found the stump of a mushroom. Something's already come along and gotten it, probably a deer or something. It's just terrible. Before we get done, let's look at the individual type of morels. Morels are, well, they come in different varieties, strangely enough. Early on in the season, say around here, mid-April, you get spike mushrooms. And these are morels, but they have a very small head on them. And they are generally very dark colored. They're called spikes because they just have this little tiny pointy top, and that's it. Later on, a week or two later, the grays start to come out. They have a normal mushroom look now, and they are generally kind of grayish in color, and they're middling size. These are usually the peak tasting mushrooms. People really love these. Later on in the season, the yellows come out, and we're in the yellow season right now. They're much larger and they're yellow colored. Now, the question is, are these really all just exactly the same mushroom and they've gotten bigger and bigger? No. No, early in the season, that style comes out and then they disappear. They don't grow into the yellow. They disappear, they dry up, and then these other ones sort of appear. I don't know exactly how it works, and morels are kind of magic anyway. You got to be careful when you're hunting them. You want to be quiet, or else they disappear. Just when you want to find them, they're gone. You got to wear the right clothes too, and have a mushroom stick if you really want to find morels. So we've got these wonderful yellows for late season. Luckily, I was able to find just a couple of these from the earlier seasons. So these guys are ready to do a little bit of seasoning and then putting a little flour on them, and in they go. The recipe just has a little bit of pepper on these guys. Just got a little bit of ground pepper. And we've got a little bit of sea salt. Again, what we want on this is to enhance the flavor, not to hide the flavor. So That's what the salt is for, is to bring out the flavor. But if we have so much salt that we can taste it, we've got too much salt. So I'm going to be very judicious with this. We can always, if we need to, add salt in the eating phase, but we want just a touch here in the cooking phase. Now let's dredge them through our flour, and I'll just set them on this plate. I could dredge them on the flour and toss them right into the pan, but I don't want to do that because I want them all to go into the pan at once so I can watch them cooking. Now let me tell you, I really want to add nutmeg to this, but if there is one dish ever that doesn't need nutmeg, this one's it. Okay, now it is time to cook our mushrooms, and we want to be very, very careful as we're doing this. These mushrooms are not easy to get a hold of, so we're going to be using all the best materials possible. And in this case, I'm not going to be using just any butter. And the recipe said we could use hog's lard. No way. We're not going to be using hog's lard on this. We're going to be using the best butter. We'll be using Kerry Gold butter. I definitely recommend using the best possible. We want to be very careful with the temperature of our fire and our cooking vessel. One of the family traditions on my wife's side of the family is there's a big mushroom feed once a year, and the whole family comes together, and the kitchen is filled with these electric frying pans. We're not going to be using electric frying pan, but they use those because they can adjust the temperature precisely. And we need to do exactly the same thing in this circumstance. So I'm going to be very careful. We're using our spider skillet so it stays off of the fire, and we want to have the most regular heat across our pan. We don't want it to get too hot. Just like that. Looks good. Now we can start to put our mushrooms in. And we don't just toss our mushrooms in and walk away, because we do not want them to burn. We so don't want these to burn. So we're gonna watch them the whole time as they cook. This could be just a little hotter. There we go. That's what we want right there. We're gonna let the pan warm up just a little bit more. Remember those English recipes I was telling you about? The complicated ones that would be sacrilegious? These morels were always mentioned in the same phrase, in the same sentence as truffles. You can think of them the same way. Very, very expensive. Morels are the same way. They're precious because they are only available for a couple of weeks a year. And there are some years they're not available at all because the weather's just not quite right. And they cannot be commercially grown. So they are a wonderful, precious thing, and we're going to be very careful in how we cook them. I usually recommend putting these into the pan with the hollow side down first, and as they cook, you can flatten them because you want to cook them, consistently over the entire piece. So if you start with the hollow, then you can flatten them out as they heat up, and then when that bottom side is cooked, you turn them over, and it just takes a little bit after that, and then they're done. You can take them right out of the pan. Once they're out of the pan and they're done draining, you do not want to let these get too cold. They go to the table hot, or at least warm, right? So they started out like that, they end up like this. There's only one way to eat morel mushrooms as far as I'm concerned, and that's with your fingers. And they're nice and crispy. Smelling out of the pan, they are incredible. There's nothing like them. Perfect crunch. Couldn't be better. These are perfect. They're like the woods bottled and concentrated. And the butter matters. You can't taste any of those spices. They're just there just to bring it out. It could not be better. These are perfect. If you've never had a chance to try morel mushrooms, you want to try these. I don't know what you're gonna need to do. Go someplace, trick somebody into serving you morel mushrooms fried like this. You've never had anything like it. They are tremendous. It's winter. It's truly the most difficult time of year. Just to survive, we've had to basically prepare all year long. And really, it doesn't matter whether we're in the city or in a frontier situation, winter is hard. But in a frontier situation, you can't go down to the store. You've got to have exactly what you need to survive for 3 months. The only store you've got is to go out in the woods and go hunting. And that works, but it's very difficult to survive that way. So we've had to, take all year long to preserve all the things that we're going to be needing this entire season. This is what our pantry looks like here in the cabin. I mean, you think about this cabin, it's a tiny room. It's probably smaller than your garage at home. And yet we've got to figure out how we're going to store a winter's amount of food in this tiny little building. This is just a little example of what you might have as a pantry here in a cabin like this. We've got bags of dried grains. We've got storage canisters that might have pickles in them, all different kinds of things. We might store something dry like sugar, etc. We've got barrels that we will use to store amounts of grain in, jugs to store liquids in. All these things, although, have to be protected. And obviously we need a lot more than that. We might be like living on top of our provisions. And there are even opportunities where we might have to take some of these things outside and bury them in a hole in the ground to protect them and to make them last the winter. This is very difficult to have an entire season's worth of food in a tiny little building like this. It's a true challenge and certainly was a challenge in that time period.
Out here in the wilderness, you can either hunt for food and forage, and it's hard to forage in the winter for the most part. You can use what your animals are giving to you that you have, stored for food and for cream, eggs, that kind of thing. And you have your stores of grains, dried vegetables, pickles, that sort of thing. That's what we've got to use. We're getting a little tired of eating meat. We're getting a little tired of eating what we're hunting day to day. So this recipe lets us use things like eggs, cream, milk, sugar that's stored back, barley that's stored back, and create something that is a little sweet, has a different texture, but still has a hearty grain in it so that you're full when you go to bed at night. We looked through a lot of recipes to find some that would work in this setting, and one that I really liked was in The Lady's Assistant by Charlotte Mason. It is French barley pudding. To a quart of cream, put 6 eggs well beaten, but only 3 of the whites. Then season it with sugar, nutmeg, a little salt, some orange flower water, and a pound of melted butter. A pound of melted butter. Mix with that 6 handfuls of French barley, boiled tender in milk, butter the dish, put it in the bake. It's that simple. We are not, our palates are not about orange flower water these days. We typically see that on a recipe and decide not to use it, so I'm not going to put that in there. All right, I've got our milk in the pan. I'm bringing it up to a boil, and what you have to do, you have to stir this the entire time. You don't want to scorch your milk. You don't want to burn at the bottom, anything like that. You want it to taste good, because this is the base for pretty much everything in the recipe. So I'm going to bring this to a boil. Once it comes to a boil, I'm going to put our barley in, and then we're going to simmer that until the barley is done. And depending on what kind of barley you're using, it'll take different amounts of time, but you'll know it's done. It's like cooking any other grain. We're going to have this recipe because we don't need a huge pudding. That's not what we're going for. Just big enough for a couple of people to eat, and this will do just fine for that. While the barley was cooking, I went ahead in this mixing bowl and I put our cream, I put our eggs, the sugar, and the nutmeg. Now it's time to incorporate the butter. You want the butter fully melted, but you don't want it so hot that it cooks your eggs. So what we're gonna do is let it cool a little bit after you take it off the fire. And then we're going to do a little bit at a time while we're stirring so that we're just incorporating the heat slowly. All right, so also while you're working with this, the point is not to whip the cream. So only stir to incorporate. Don't try to mix everything up together in there. Now we're going to add the barley. Essentially what we've made here is a custard. And so we want this barley to kind of act like a crust. So you don't want to add so much barley that it's all incorporated together. You definitely want more custard than you have barley. So just be a little careful as you incorporate it, not to get too much in there.
Well, we brought Brandon in so he can try this out with us, and well, I don't know, this baked for quite a while. Solidified right up and smells really good.
Yeah,
really good smell.
Yeah, it's got that classic custard smell to it.
Yeah. That barley really set up. And it's got a good bite to it.
And that nutmeg really comes through in this. We put a lot in there, but man, it's good. I had a little bit more salt to this one than I thought that I would. And it comes through, and it kind of gives that savory feel with the sweet. I like it. You can really bite into the barley. It's got a dessert feel to it, but it eats like a meal.
Oh, yeah.
It's hearty. It is hearty.
Well, and, we're eating it hot. You could even slice this up and, it could be good for probably 3 or 4 days. You could come back to this, especially in this kind of weather.
Man, I love that barley texture.
It's completely different. Really, the sweetness, the texture is different. Everything is different about this than the standard meal that you would have, day in, day out.
Right.
So good.
Yeah. I feel like the texture thing is a big thing, right? Because meat, it's all, it's just the same feel, the same thing. But this has even got multiple textures going on in it. That heavy cream it's very creamy where the barley is not.
Yes.
And you can kind of get that perfect bite that's got everything, or you can separate it a little bit.
Right. It is really good. Well, and these grains aren't ground. So it's a whole step of processing you don't have to do. You don't have to, turn it into flour and all that. You can take that barley and use it right away, right from storage into your dish.
Yeah.
No extra process.
And there are, I think, in a modern sense, when I think of oats, I think of oatmeal, which makes me think of breakfast cereal. Yeah. And coming up in Kentucky, we always mixed jam into that. So it's like a sweet thing, right? But you see so many recipes for oats in soups or in, kind of a stew or a hash kind of setting. And they just go both ways so well.
Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today we're getting back into Spanish cookery of the 18th century. This one is called flattened meatballs. It sounds so fun. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. I just came back from St. Augustine, Florida, an amazing place to visit with hundreds of years of Spanish tradition down in that area of the country. And that certainly affects what happens in all the rest of North America during the 18th century that we study so much. I visited Castillo San Marcos and the whole historic district there, the amazing Spanish Military Hospital Museum. There's so much to cover. But as soon as I came back, I was so excited to dig into Spanish cookery of the time period and see how that connects up with all the other different kind of cookery that we talk about here on the channel. So when I think about Spanish cookery, this is my current go-to cookbook. Vicky Hayward goes through Juan Altamira's cookbook from 1745. She gives us an interpretation of that and then works through the recipes in a modern sense. So it's definitely a cookbook that just anybody can pick up and dig into, not the typical 18th century cookbook that we normally use. So she's got this split up into wonderful sections, just like the original author did. And there's a section on travelers and feeding travelers. And I picked out this recipe because it was nice and simple, something like they would have been able to do in St. Augustine for just regular folks. This isn't super fancy cooking at a very expensive house, but just normal everyday cookery. This recipe is called flattened meatballs. It says, hash lean meat as for meatballs, throw in a little cured ham, and for every half a pound of hash, add 4 eggs, a few grated breadcrumbs, sugar and cinnamon, but no spice. Now that's interesting, at least for us in modern America. Make meatballs, put the skillet on the fire with some good lard in it, make it very hot for frying, flatten your meatballs with a spatula, pick them up, put them in the skillet, fry them well on one side, then on the other side, put them on plates, serve them with sugar and cinnamon on top to unexpected guests. So, unexpected guests, what this is fast food. You don't have anything in the house ready to serve up to somebody who's just shown up at your doorstep. So you're gonna make these little flattened meatballs. Sounds like a lot of fun, and I certainly don't normally put cinnamon on my meatballs, so we're gonna try that out. This ought to be great, and who knows, it's sort of like the ancestor to a slider. I don't know, this is gonna be fun. Let's put these flattened meatballs together, and I've got about a pound of ground beef. We're gonna add, and now there's no exact amount here, so we're gonna add some of this cured ham. I'm just gonna take some of this ham, and it's diced up nice and fine so it'll mix in here well. It just says a little breadcrumb. We don't know, again, how much we're gonna put in. I'm just gonna put in that much. The recipe calls for 4 eggs per half pound. I've got a pound here. 8 eggs sounds like a lot. So I'm gonna start with 4. We'll see how that mixes together. Well, the texture is still very liquidy, so I'm gonna add more breadcrumbs in to fight back on these eggs, and I think I definitely have enough eggs in here. The consistency looks really good. I have enough breadcrumbs that this really started to feel about right. So we're gonna form these up into our meatballs, a little bit bigger than a chicken's egg. I've got the lard in the pan, now the meatballs go in. They are ready off the pan, and we served up cinnamon sugar on top. Yes, meatballs with cinnamon sugar. Sounds like this will be fun. And let's give it a try. Boy, it's got a great texture. A lot of eggs in there. And so it isn't like a dry hamburgery kind of flavor, but actually very moist, great texture. And it's very interesting with the cinnamon sugar on top. And I mean interesting in a good way. In fact, Only one thing would make this better. I can't do it. So only one thing would make these better. Just a little nutmeg. But, you know, we were looking at these as we were doing the video, and we said, you know what? You know, this would look slightly better as possibly a little slider. You know, you probably recognize this. Now, is this the ancestor to our modern day slider? I have no idea, but let's find out if it works as one. I don't know how I'm going to eat all that. It's like a mouthful. That is an extraordinary slider. Very good. So truly, the texture is great. It's crispy on the outside, but yet it isn't tough at all. So it's a nice, smooth texture with all that egg in there. It really helps it out, I think. Just really super. And going along with the bread, I mean, those mix well together. Although, as the original in the recipe book with the cinnamon sugar on top, definitely something that I can see, again, a quick and easy thing to fix for travelers. This is the fast food of the 18th century. It's like you need to fix something for somebody who's just shown up. These are perfect for that. I can see exactly why the original author, the original cook said these would be great fast food. We cook this beef, we let it get cold, and then we serve it out. This recipe is called beef le vinaigre, or the vinegar beef. I can't wait to try this out. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. This recipe today comes out of The New and Easy Method of Cookery by Elizabeth Cleland, 1755, so it's kind of early, and this has a lot of Scottish influence in this particular cookbook. And it's interesting that she pulled this recipe out, and again, this one is strange in the fact that it's kind of served cold. It's a cold collation dish that has a lot of wine in it. It's even that vinegar kind of flavor here shows up. So it's definitely different than something that I'm normally used to. I'm not used to a bitter kind of flavor in a meat anyway, but it's going to be doing some very, very interesting things. Let me read to you this recipe. It's beef le vinaigre. Get a slice of beef 3 inches thick, most lean from the buttock. Stew it with a little water and a gill of white wine. Season it with salt and pepper, cloves, and a bundle of sweet herbs and a bay leaf. Let it boil till it is very tender, then set it a cooling, and when cold, serve it up with a slice of lemon and a little vinegar. Okay, so this one is tough to interpret. We can't just grab this recipe and do it. We actually have to think about what's going on here and put it together. Get a slice of beef 3 inches thick, most lean, no problem. Stew it with a little water and a gill of wine. Stop. And then it says season it with pepper, salt, cloves, herbs, bay leaf. Stop. Then it says let it boil till it is very tender. Then set it a cooling. And when it's cold, serve it up. The problem here is she talks about stewing it, and then she talks about boiling it. Now, is that 2 different operations? Do we stew it and then we boil it? Or is this actually one operation, we stew it, boiling it, right? And I think that's what's actually going on. She doesn't say stew it, then take it out and put it in boiling water. She says stew it, boiling it this long. So this one can be tough, and you could do it several different ways. I think though the right way is to have this, you make up, you know, how you have it cooking in the pan and you just let it boil, stew until it's very tender. So we're gonna stew this up in a deep pan. I've got a deep fry pan here. We could use a Dutch oven, that would work great in this situation. We're gonna put some hot water in there and get that going. We need maybe a half a cup of water going on in this pan. We're gonna put our meat in. Once it's up to temperature, add a little bit, or our gill of wine, which is a 1/4 cup of wine. Put a little bit on top and put it into our stewing liquid. We're gonna let this cook a little bit before we do anything else. Once I flip this over, then we'll start to put in the spices. So let's talk about what's really going on with the wine here. It's a very, very important part of cooking this. It isn't, I mean, we could use just water, but it's not going to work as well. That wine is going to help break down this very tough beef. And beef can be tough in the time period, especially she called for lean beef. So we want this wine, the acid of the wine, to help tenderize the meat while it's cooking. It's going to make it so much better. Once our beef has been stewing for a few minutes, now we can go to the spicing. Now this talks about salt, pepper, cloves. Well, we have something that's perfect for this. That's the kitchen pepper that we sell, the Townsends kitchen pepper. Wonderful for this dish. It has the salt, the pepper, and it has the cloves, which is kind of important. Also has a few things like nutmeg. Great mix, does it all in one. So kitchen pepper is great. You can check out our kitchen pepper on our website, townsends.us. Also, we've got these sweet herbs that go in, and we're just gonna put a little bundle of those. We can take them out later, and a bay leaf. Now that we've got the spices in, we're gonna let this cook down. As we turn it over, you can put a little spice right on top of the meat and then flip it back over. And we wanna add a little bit more water to it because again, it needs to boil as it were. So simmer, we need to make sure we have enough hot water in there to boil. And if you can, put a cover on this and it'll kind of hold that heat in and hold the flavors in at the same time. So we're gonna put a pie pan over the top of our skillet. There's nothing left to do but wait on this until it's done nice and tender. We sliced this up nice and thin and it's cold. It's meant to be served cold. We've got our lemon slices. We've already poured our vinegar over the top. I'm gonna add just a touch of salt and we can give one of these little pieces a try. Well, let me add a little bit of lemon here. There we go. Let's find out just how this one turned out. Oh, a giant piece. You were.
No, how was it?
It's really, really good. You definitely want to cut this in smaller pieces. This is nice and tender, especially when it's cut nice and thin like this. And it would be just, you can see this on served with a bunch of other dishes. So that, obviously this isn't the main course. So a wonderful way to serve this beef. And while this is cooking, you're cooking other things at the same time, aren't you? So it is that kind of a dish that you would set on the table with 4 or 5 other things. The spices come right out in this. We definitely get some of those. You'd think they might get lost in that boiling, but no, they're here. And the vinegar, the lemon come through and change this dish. So this isn't, just a raw roast beef that you would, cook over the fire like we've done in the past. But that vinegar is giving you a nice little kick that is definitely a little different than just your typical roast beef. Every one of these recipes is a word problem. So just like in school when you had these math problems and, it's like, what's going on with these? You have to figure out the formula for the recipe and understand what they actually mean by each one of these words. We can misinterpret them in our 200 years later vocabulary. So we do have to dig in on these to understand exactly what the original cook was really trying to get at. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today we'll be cooking a food that is meant to heal the sick. It's not soup, it's not hot cereal, it's not custard, it's somewhere in between. It's called panada. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. I don't know about you, but I've never heard about panada in a modern sense. You'll find it in a modern cookbook. It's interesting, it shows up in the 18th century cookbooks, but if you go back, it'll show up in 16th century literature, especially 17th century. It's English, sometimes you'll find French references, and as I've been digging, found references to it in Italy. Now, it's an interesting recipe in that it does stay pretty much the same. There are two kinds of versions, a sweet version, a savory version, and it changes a little. You'll even find it in 19th century cookbooks, but it definitely starts to change into something a bit different than what the 18th century version is. Kind of more desserty and not necessarily made with bread. Panada is classically made with bread. And it is, again, something for people that are invalids, sick people, children, but not necessarily always that way. We find something very, very similar served in taverns for breakfast in North America in the 18th century. I mean, that's the only thing they're serving, a great big bowl of panada, and they're eating it up. That I find a bit strange, because it's not the kind of thing you would think of as tavern food. Got a couple recipes here. This one is from John Knott. This is early, this is 1723 or so. It says, to make a panado, there are multiple fun spellings of this. To make a panado, let's see, set a quart of spring waterina skillet. Oh no, it's all run together. Sorry about that. It says, set on a quart of spring water in a skillet. Let it boil sometime over the fire. Cut a penny white loaf into slices as thin as a wafer. Lay them on a dish set over a chafing dish of coals. Put your water into it with some large mace, a quarter of a pound of currants picked clean and washed. Let it stew till it is thick enough. Those are always great instructions. Then, having dissolved some fine sugar in rose water, sweeten it to your palate. That's a sweet version. That definitely is something that you would probably serve as dessert. So we have white bread. So he specifically talks about white bread, cut very, very thin. He's gently cooking it over these a chafing dish with coals, so it's not a fast boil. It's got mace in it, which is very, very common for panada. I don't know why mace and not nutmeg, but mace and currants, and then we actually sweeten it. And sometimes in different recipes, you will also add some wine. I think in his other one, there's another recipe here in the same cookbook, mace, cinnamon, currants, and then it gets canary or white wine. Beat some yolks of eggs in and put it with sugar. So it's definitely turning into something like a custard. So there's definitely multiple versions even here in the early 18th century. Now, the classic cookbook from the 18th century is Hannah Glass's cookbook, which is probably the most popular all throughout the time period. Hannah Glass has a recipe for panada, and it's probably the simplest one. And if you're going to find reprints in other cookbooks, which, people are always stealing from one cookbook to another, it's going to be this recipe. You must take a quart of water in a nice clean saucepan, a blade of mace, a large piece of crumb of bread. Let it boil 2 minutes, not very long at all. Then take out the bread, bruise it in a basin very fine, mix as much water as will make it as thick as you would have. The rest you pour away. Sweeten it to your palate. Put in a piece of butter as big as a walnut. Don't put in any wine, she says. it spoils it. And then you may grate in a little nutmeg. This is a hearty and good diet for sick people. So this recipe definitely is a very, very simple version and specifically meant for sick people because it's very, very easy to digest. You know, it's not like meat or even dry bread, which, you know, can kind of sit in your stomach in a strange way, but the most simplest thing for someone to digest. Now, it's strange that we have this version, which is oriented towards sick people, and then the one from 1723, which was definitely more desserty with currants and all kinds of strange things in it. So we're going to be doing a recipe that's somewhere in between these two, and we'll just see what it turns out like. So today's recipe is out of The Experienced English Housekeeper. This is 1769. And it's actually got a couple of different recipes, one for sweet, one for savory. We're gonna do the savory one here. To make a panada, grate the crumb of a penny loaf, boil it in a pint of water with 1 onion and a few peppercorns till quite thick and soft. Then put in 2 ounces of butter, a little salt, half a pint of thick cream. It's gonna be good. Keep it stirring till it is like a fine custard. Pour it into a soup plate, serve it up, and then there's a little added piece. You may use sugar or currants instead of onions and peppercorns, if you please. We're gonna be doing this with the onions and peppercorns. So we have our penny loaf, and I've already sliced this up. We don't want it to just toss it in whole. One of those recipes said to slice it thin, so I sliced it nice and thin. We have our onion. We're not gonna chop this up. We're gonna leave this mostly whole in there because I think we wanna take it back out. We just want the onion flavor. We've got some butter, we've got peppercorns, a little salt, and our cream. We're ready to go. We're gonna put the water on the fire and get it boiling. So frankly, when I first read this recipe, I did not think it sounded good at all, but this actually looks good. Smells really good too. When it was on the fire, we broke it up with the spoon a little bit so that those bread pieces broke up, cooked it for about a half an hour, and it really kind of thickened up and lost its texture, so it kind of broke down, which is what I wanted to happen. Off the fire it comes, and we took out the onion and added in the butter, let that melt, then put in the cream and a little bit of nutmeg. And well, tell you what, it really looks good. So let's find out what this really tastes like. Here we go. We'll mix in a little bit of that nutmeg. And those peppercorns are still hiding out in there, so be careful. Wow. Whoa. This is really good. I mean, it's really good. This is the savory version, not the sweet version, which is, I smell the nutmeg and it makes me think of sweet things. It's wonderfully savory, just the right amount of salt that got added in there, butter, cream. Well, it's just really, really good. I can see why this would be something in the dessert book. And that John Knott book is full of kind of high-end recipes, so it is really good. I can see how this could definitely be something for an ill person, someone who was sick, and they needed something that they could eat that wouldn't upset their stomach, because this is so smooth, so innocuous, especially if you knocked back the spices, you didn't make it too sweet or too salty. This could be a very, very bland food if you wanted to make it for someone who was ill, and it'd be perfect for that, and there's just nothing to upset you. So we mentioned that this was food for the sick, and that's, sometimes this would be served in taverns or even as a dessert, but it was also food for the poor. Very interesting story. In the late 18th century, there was a journal about someone from England traveling in northern Italy, and they saw a group of boys eating out of one big bowl. They were eating panada, and they were talking to the boys about where this came from, and they said that their mother had died, their father was begging on the streets, and they would climb the trees and pick grapevine leaves for a restaurateur. They were right outside of a restaurant, and he would use these grapevine leaves to put stoppers in bottles or decanters to keep flies out and whatnot. And he paid the boys in panada. So that's the only thing they could afford to eat. Very interesting story right there from the 18th century. One of the things I love about digging into these recipes is you never know where you're going to go. Sometimes the recipe works out exactly like you expect it. Other times you get really surprised. And so you really have to try them out if you want to know what it's going to turn into. This one is exactly that, a very surprising recipe, and very good when I did not expect it to be good at all. So amazed by this one. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and I'm joined today by Ryan, and we are going to dig into the origins of the American biscuit. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century.
Our friends at White Lily Flour got a hold of us and they wanted to do a collaboration video. We were really excited about it because they have a great product, but we didn't know the best way to serve them and us. We settled on a biscuit, but that gets really difficult in the 18th century. So I started to talk to John and say, how can we tie this in?
So there is no biscuit like this. The epitome of, a dinner time biscuit that I love these things, but they are not 18th century, but there are the roots to this wonderful biscuit that go down into the 18th century, and it's a very, very particular American story. So I thought it would make a great episode where we can kind of make something like this and the 18th century version so we can compare the two, maybe even three, right? So there's a lot of different kinds of biscuits as they go through history. But what's really going on, what makes this biscuit kind of different, is the leavening effect. Where does this light and fluffy biscuit come from? Because everything from the 18th century is usually either yeast, or it's a sour leaven, like you could think of sourdough bread, or possibly something that's leavened with eggs whipped up. So you've got lots of air in there. Those are the kinds of leavening, the airiness that you find in the 18th century, but not what we're used to, which is, in this case, pearl ash, or you might be more familiar with baking powder or baking soda. So we'll be working with three different kinds of biscuit recipes. We've got our very, very modern example here of a today's biscuit. I've got the very, very early recipe that gets us sort of on the road to biscuits. This is 1799. And what have you got?
Yeah, this is a late 19th century recipe that uses baking powder as a leavening agent.
So between these three, we'll kind of hit that timeline of sort of proto-American biscuit, right? And then biscuit as the 19th century, Civil War, and a little bit later, and then the classic, today's biscuit. We'll be able to see what the differences are like in how you make them and what they taste like. I wanted to take just a moment to talk about White Lily Flour. So recently we were contacted by the folks at White Lily Flour. They said they enjoyed what we were doing on the channel and they thought we might enjoy trying out some of their flour. Communicating with the folks at White Lily Flour has been wonderful. They sent us a batch to try out and we thought, let's put it to the test. All the biscuits that we're making in this episode were made with White Lily Flour, and we use a lot of flour on this channel, and this has been some of the best flour we've ever used. I encourage you to try this flour. For more information on White Lily Flour, visit whitelily.com.
This morning I got up to make some nice modern biscuits, and there are a couple of things that they really stress in modern recipes that you don't see in period cookbooks. One is that the butter stays cold. I put the butter in the freezer for about 30 minutes and then I grated that into the dry ingredients. The other is laminating the dough. You'll see that with other types of pastry in the 18th century, but you don't see that with biscuits. And so if you want these nice flaky layers, you want cold butter and you want to laminate the dough. So that's what I did for these modern ones. It's a little bit different than what we're going to do. In the 19th century recipe, you'll see baking powder, which is like modern biscuits, but you're not going to see the cold ingredients and you're not going to see the lamination of the dough.
So the real big difference is as we go back into the 18th century, we find a recipe by Margaretta Curley, and she writes to a newspaper in Great Britain, and she's telling them about the American potash cake. And it's such a great story. It's a giant long letter, and she's explaining when you would make these and why they do it, and then she gives us the recipe for it. Wonderful, wonderful recipe. What are the big differences here? Well, the leavening agent isn't baking powder, but it's actually it's potassium carbonate. Now that's a very different sort of thing than baking powder, which has the component of sodium bicarbonate. So sodium bicarbonate is a very active ingredient here. It gives a lot of lift. This one is a primitive version of that. It's just carbonate, not bicarbonate, so it kind of gives you a half lift, right? So it's and it's potassium, which can, if you use too much of it, give you a soapy flavor. So you don't want to overdo it trying to get it fluffier, and then you get soapy biscuits. But everything else is pretty similar. We're going to be using almost the same amount of flour. We're going to use a little bit of milk here, and this one has butter in it. I think his recipe, he's going to be working with just cream. So there's some fats here. This one also is meant to be a little bit more desserty, so it has some sugar in it, but not a great quantity. So let me read to you Margaretta Curley's recipe out of this big letter. She says, a good recipe for this cake is as follows. Take of a good wheaten flour 2 pounds, of butter 1/2 pound, of sugar 1/2 pound. Add to these a heaping teaspoonful of salt of tartar or any other form of potash or pearl ash that will hiss when vinegar is poured on it. We're not supposed to use vinegar in this recipe, but it's just how you identify it. The potash must be dissolved in a little water before it is added to the other materials, and the sugar is stirred in about a pint of milk, and being freed from lumps, the whole must be mixed and kneaded well together. This may be done in a few minutes, and the dough will instantly be fit for rolling out and baking.
So my recipe is from the Farm and Home Cookbook, and it's baking powder biscuits number 2. To 1 quart sifted flour, add 3 teaspoons baking powder, a little salt, 1 cup rich sweet cream, and milk enough to make a dough of the proper consistency. It's that simple. So in this time period, I've seen references to not using rolling pin, but just using your hands. And if you haven't made biscuits before, it's really easy. The key is to not overwork the dough. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to mix your dry ingredients in a bowl, give it a quick swirl so they're all incorporated together. You add your wet ingredients, mix those ingredients up into a dough, don't overwork it. Then you're going to turn it out onto a floured surface, press it out about 1 inch thick, and then cut them into circles, put them on a baking sheet, and in the oven they go.
It's time to try out our 3 different kinds of biscuits. We've got the 1799, we've got the late 19th century, let's call them 1900. And then we have the modern day biscuit. Which one are you going to try first?
Let's go earlier to later.
Okay, earlier to later.
So, let's see here. You want to break it?
Yeah, so here's our original Margaretta Curly pot ash cake. And obviously you can see by the size, they started out about the same thickness. These did not grow as much, that's for sure. But
They look like it worked.
yeah,
It's
there's
fluffy.
some leavening in there. They're not rock hard like a ship's biscuit. These have some sugar in them.
Just a little bit sweet. Not too much. These are really good.
Now this recipe did not have any salt in it. And you can definitely tell that it probably needed a little salt. She expected some of that. If you use sodium bicarbonate in here, you can get some of that sodium from it, and you get a little bit of salt flavor even if you don't add salt in a soda biscuit. This one just has the potassium. It's even better with the butter.
What isn't?
Yeah, exactly. Really good though. These baked the same amount of time. Both of the biscuits we were working with.
Yep.
You can tell though what's happening with this one. If you look real closely at some of these biscuits, you'll see that they're starting to crack open. So the leavening only starts to act when it's heated up. So if the biscuit starts to bake on the outside, it gets hard, and then it starts to expand, and you get cracking.
Right. Whereas these, we could see them starting to rise even before we put them in the oven.
Right.
And then they rise even more when they're in the oven.
Right, so baking powder is sort of double acting.
Yeah.
As soon as it gets wet, the acid starts to react with the baking soda that's built into that, and they start rising just as soon as they get wet, but they rise some more when they heat up.
They look a ton different on the
Yeah.
inside.
Yeah, so definitely fluffier.
Yeah. Right.
The outside isn't so hard.
They're not getting those layers that we talked about with the modern biscuit. Kind of, maybe a little bit, but not so much. Tastes like a breakfast biscuit.
It does.
Yeah, this one, the one from the 18th century had that sweetness that felt like it could be a snack or a dessert or something like that. But this is, when you taste this immediately, I think you're like, "Where's the sausage gravy?" This is a breakfast biscuit.
Yeah. Very, very good. But you can see there's definitely a evolution as we're working here, lighter and fluffier. We got a little bit more salt, a little more savory flavor in it. The final biscuit to test this is the, well, where would you find this?
I mean, if you look up a biscuit recipe, if you just Google one, you'll find a biscuit exactly like this. This is what people want when they think biscuits in 2021. And already it doesn't just like break,
Right.
it kind of like bends and tears.
And we get these
Tons of layers.
wonderful flaking layers and flakiness.
Right.
Much more delicate. We have more natural sort of a buttery saltiness in here. Does this have butter in it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Quite a bit, actually. Yeah, it's this is a lot like if you got a can of biscuits and you weren't going to make them homemade, and it's like a can of whatever brand biscuits, popped it open, baked them. You're going to get something like this. I feel like the 1900 one is more like maybe what my grandmother would have made, and it doesn't have those layers. It's a little bit more dense, but it still has the salt. But yeah, it's really good.
So the interesting take on all of these is that they're meant to be a fast bread-like item. You don't take hours and hours to make these. You just whip them right up. She even mentions that in the 1799 recipe. She says, oh, you have guests come over and you didn't expect them. You don't have time 4 hours to bake a loaf of bread. You need bread right away. And that's why they invented these. They invented them to be a quick bread-like thing to give your guests.
Yeah, I wonder if that's why some of them you'll see more ingredients than others too. Like these 1901, it's just like cream, salt, flour. That's it, or a little bit baking powder. But
Yeah.
Everything you'll probably have on hand because it's a pantry item.
And you can
store
just
back.
make it right away.
Yeah.
Isn't it great to see this 200-year evolution of a simple proto-biscuit that's not quite what we would expect to be a biscuit at all, as it changes into the 19th century, and then we get to our wonderful, fluffy, modern biscuit. I love this whole tracing food back through time to see exactly where it came from and the amazing American roots of our modern biscuit. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today we're going to be cooking something so simple. You've probably got all the ingredients in your kitchen, so we can try it out right away. It sounds so good. It's a fowl pie. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So we've been recently researching all sorts of meat pies, specifically chicken and turkey, and we've looked through basically dozens of cookbooks, English cookbooks from the 18th century, and amazingly, most of them are very, very complicated. They've got ducks in them and quail and bacon and who knows what else in these pies. Very, very complicated and expensive pies. I wanted something a little simpler, so I went to Amelia Simmons's 1796 cookbook called American Cookery. And this one's always got wonderful, simple American cooking in it. Let me read to you part of Amelia Simmons's recipe here. It says, or if your oven be poor, because maybe your oven isn't great. Parboil your chickens with half a pound of butter, put the pieces with the remaining 1 pound of butter and half the gravy into the paste, and while boiling, thicken the residue of the gravy, and when the pie is drawn out of the oven, open the crust and add the gravy. And earlier she talks about the seasoning of it. But there's just, this pie is so amazingly simple. I mean, you got the crust, you got the chicken, butter, gravy, little salt and pepper. That's it. That's what we're gonna make. This pie version is the one with the pour oven, so the chicken can be already pre-cooked. Great if you want to use leftovers or just a slightly parboiled kind of chicken, but you want it to be better than just a boiled chicken. That doesn't taste good. So we're going to use our leftover chicken pieces here, or if you got turkey, that'll work. I just want to get about half of the chicken in here. We're going to add a little bit of salt to this layer, a little bit of pepper. A lot of these fowl recipes have nutmeg in them. This particular one didn't, but we're going to go ahead and add a little bit, give it just a little bit of extra flavor there, one that we're not normally used to in a chicken pie. I'm going to add some butter here, lots of butter. She called for like a whole half a pound of butter. This is a smaller pie. She was probably making a big pie. It's the only amount that was in that particular recipe. So you always have to gauge it to what you're putting together here. Let's put just a little bit more chicken in here to fill this up. There we are. We're gonna add just a little bit more salt and pepper up on top. Maybe just a touch, again, of nutmeg. There we are. And let's put just a little bit more butter right up underneath this crust, right up on top, because that way it'll go sink right down through all those chicken pieces. Right before we put the lid on this, we're going to take about half of our gravy. Again, we don't know exactly what the amount is. I'll probably put about a half a cup in here. That'll really help moisten this up. The rest of that gets set aside so we can make a thick gravy to pour into the top after the pie comes out of the oven. That's a leer, and that again will go in there and soak it up and really just solidify those contents. Oh, seriously, that's it. I mean, you toss these components in here, you put the top on, it's ready to go in the oven. There is nothing more to it. We're gonna bake this for about 30 minutes at 350 degrees because this chicken is already basically pre-cooked in here. If they were raw chicken pieces, maybe we'd cook it a little bit longer. We'd have to make sure that the crust didn't get burnt. That's about it. It's just that simple. Let's get it in the oven. There is the pie. The gravy was so easy, just right over the fire. A little butter with some flour, and then we put in the extra gravy broth that we had from our chicken, maybe a little salt and pepper, and hey, that was it. Just thickened right up. The pie comes out of the oven. I took the little top off, poured that gravy in. Now, I didn't want to wait forever. This smells so good. I want to eat it right now. But normally you would let this pie set down and let it get cooler so it would congeal a little bit. Now this is still so warm that it kind of fell apart, but that's all right. It smells way too good. Let's find out just if it really comes up to the mark. Man, that is fabulous. Just the right amount of saltiness. The chicken is so cooked through, and those spices up on top of that. It doesn't get any better. This is the best chicken pie and incredibly simple. Apples and potatoes. They're not two ingredients that I normally put together in a recipe, but today's pie recipe uses both. I can't wait to see how they turn out. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. I'm always looking for recipes that are very, very common today, yet we can connect with a place and a time in history. An 18th century recipe. Well, apple pies are one of those tricky recipes that can be difficult to find in period cookbooks. I have done a couple of different apple pies in the past, and a one that had a custard topping, that was really good, and the very, very simple apple pie recipe that's in William Ellis's book. Now this one is from Cookery and Pastry by Mrs. MacIver. This one's from 1783, and it's really, really interesting in that it's got these potatoes and apples together. Why potatoes and apples? Are the potatoes in there because they're trying to stretch it and make it less expensive with fewer apples? Or are they really there to change the texture, to make it better? Boil some potatoes. Pare and cut some apples. Lay a row of apples in the dish, a row of potatoes above them, then some pieces of fresh butter, that's got to be good, above the potatoes. Cut apples, potatoes, butter alternately until the pie is filled up. Sweeten it to your taste. Take rather more apples than potatoes. It is much better of having a little citron or orange peel in it. Put a little water in all apple pies. Cover it with puff paste. Let's get started with the ingredients. Obviously we need apples. Getting an apple variety that's exactly like they would have in the 18th century can be a little tricky. I'm gonna make it easy for you. Let's use a Granny Smith apple. That's something you can find in the grocery store today, and that's gonna be close enough to an 18th century apple for us. The recipe calls for boiled potatoes. Now we don't wanna overboil these potatoes. They're just kind of parboiled. We don't want them to just totally disintegrate. They're not going to stay in that layer like the recipe calls for if we overboil these. So these are just partially boiled. We've already peeled them. We've got a little bit of sugar because it's supposed to be sweetened up. We don't know exactly how much. They're not giving us any quantity of ingredients, so we get to sweeten to taste. In the 18th century, they probably wouldn't have used very much sugar. And of course, we've got some butter. So the orange here, just the orange peel that we need, it's the only thing that's really kind of setting this off as a fancy dish. Just the apples and the potatoes, that's a very low end kind of a pie here. So the orange is sort of what this sets this off. And it's even mentioned as an optional thing in the recipe. So if we were gonna make a fancy version, we're gonna put the orange peel in. If we're not gonna make the fancy version, we just leave it out. And of course, we need some pie crust. And it just mentions a top. in this. So it's so many times in the 18th century, these pies mention maybe just putting a little paste around the edge of the pie pan and then putting a top on it. This isn't a pie like we think of today where, you know, it's got 2 layers of crust and you can bring it out in this perfect pie shape. They didn't eat these pies like that. You couldn't, because you didn't have a crust all underneath there. So you just gotta scoop the stuff out like you would a casserole or something. You scoop it out and serve it that way. That's what we're gonna do with this pie. So we just have a little bit of paste around the outside of the pie pan, a little covering here. It calls for puff paste. That can be a little tricky to work with. We just have a standard pie crust, and we do have some pie crust episodes that you can go back and check out. The assembly of this pie is very easy. We already have our apples sliced up and our potatoes sliced up, very, very similar sized. We're gonna start off with a layer of apple slices, all nestled together here, all in one direction. We're gonna fill up that bottom, put on 1 layer of potatoes on top of that. We're going to add sugar, not a whole lot, and a few dollops of butter in each row. So the next row, more apples, more potatoes, again, more sugar and more butter. As we finish this pie, we do put 1 smaller layer of apples on the very top. She calls for more apples than potatoes. To finish this off, we have our orange peel. We're very carefully peeled off the very, very outer layer of our orange peel. We don't want any of that white pith that's on the inside of that. That's bitter. Slice this up into little tiny pieces and sprinkle this all over the inside of the pie. Let's wet our fingers and seal on the very top layer of pie crust. She called for a little bit of water to be added to the inside of this pie. Let's make sure to get that in there. I did go ahead and cut a small vent to release that steam. Today we're using our mud oven, and we've had a fire going in this all morning. It's up to a nice 450, maybe even 500 degrees. We're gonna slide this pie in and let it bake for 30 to 40 minutes. It really depends on how big the pie is and how hot that oven is. Very interesting looking pie. Definitely not the kind of typical apple pie look that we are used to, but it certainly smells like an apple pie. All the pieces are holding up pretty well in this pie, so I'm very, very intrigued about how the flavor turns out. So we're just going to try out a piece and see what we get. Well, that is a pretty good apple pie. The potato stands out more than I expected it to. There's not a lot of, we don't have our typical apple pie spices in here. But I think it holds up really well. By the time you put together, a little bit of the crust that you get and the potato, the apple, just a hint of that orange in there. And really that's mostly kind of an aroma that you get. So, yeah, I think it's a very, very interesting apple pie. I'm thinking I'm liking the way these things go together. I like the way the apple and the potato goes together. If you didn't know the potato was in there, you might get tricked for a while. No, that's really good. That is very good. You definitely want to get that orange peel sliced into small bits all over it so that flavor gets spread throughout the whole thing, because it really, really makes a difference. And I guess the question is really what's going on with the potato? Is it there to stretch it out so you don't have to use as much apple? Or is it there for softening the texture? and it's probably both. I think it's really working out well, giving it a little bit softer texture. Of course, it's going to be a little bit softer than your apples, but yet it's still holding together, and it takes on some of the flavor of the apple while it's in there. So I think it's both. It really does stretch the amount of apple you need. You don't have to use as much apple, and it adds to the texture, creates just a little bit more softness, but still has some, it doesn't turn into mashed potatoes on you. So I've had pickles, I've had eggs. We've done pickled eggs. That's a great one. How about if we took a poached egg and we put it on fried pickles? That sounds very early American, doesn't it? That's what we're doing today. Thanks for joining us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. I'm digging for recipes the other day in Charlotte Mason's cookbook. And Charlotte Mason's cookbook, we've used this cookbook a number of times, and it's a wonderful hidden gem 18th century cookbook that everyone ought to check out. And this recipe is amazing. I've never seen one quite like it, especially in today's cookery. So we're going to be working with cucumbers and eggs. And of course, usually with cucumbers, we do something like pickling them, right? And there's like bread and butter pickles and that, easy pickling, hard pickling. That's like the pickles you buy at the store. This one, we're going to use cucumbers and we're going to pickle them, but then we're doing more. So let me read this recipe to you. It's called Eggs with Cucumbers. And I picked out this because cucumbers, it's this time of year right now. I was like, this is cucumber time. What do you do when you have a garden full of cucumbers? Here we go. Peel some cucumbers, cut them in half, take out the seeds, slice them and some onions, steep them in salt and vinegar for an hour. Sounds real familiar, doesn't it? Here's where we take the twist. We dry them and we fry them. Okay, when they're a little brown, flour them. Then put them to some good gravy. Let them stew. The sauce must not be thin. If it's not tart enough, so we need it to be tart. If it's not tart enough, add a little lemon juice, some pepper, some salt if wanted. Poach and fry some eggs. Cut the whites neatly round. So a lot of these recipes are pretty fancy recipes, so they're looking for presentation here. They want beautiful round eggs. And then serve them on the cucumbers. So we have these sort of stewed cucumbers in a thick gravy, and then we set these beautiful little round eggs on top. So we're gonna do some poached eggs, try to make them nice and round. This one, I just have no idea where it's going at in flavors. I mean, where do you, fried cucumbers in a stewed sauce? We're gonna see what this turns into. Our first step on this recipe is our cucumber preparation. And we're just going to quarter this cucumber. I'm gonna try to slice it right down the middle, kind of. There we go. There's our 1/2. Let's just slice this the other way. Oh, fresh cucumber always smells great. Once these are quartered up, taking the seeds out is very, very simple. Probably cucumbers in the 18th century might have been a little more prolific with the seeds. These are very easy to take out though. Okay, you're saying, John, you just messed up, didn't you? Yes, John just messed up. I forgot to peel this silly cucumber before, so I got to do it the hard way. So bear with me while I peel these split up cucumbers. So we're gonna put our pickle together here. We've got our cucumbers sliced up, and here's our solution, and it's vinegar. This is mostly apple cider vinegar, a little white vinegar too, but it doesn't matter. 18th century, probably been using just apple cider vinegar. We've got our spears of cucumber here, and then our onion that I've sort of sliced up and split in half. And we'll get those all done in there. And they're supposed to steep in here. It's like marinating for about an hour or so. And we'll come back and these will be ready to put in the frying pan. It's tasting time. It's ready to go. It's cooked up. You know, I'm gonna leave the poached egg sort of on top there for a while. We're just gonna let it go. What I'm interested in is what's going on with the cucumber right off the top, and I don't know if I'm ready for this. I mean, the gravy part sounds great, right? But cucumber in there? Okay, this is really good. Definitely something I was not expecting. Fried pickles and gravy. Whoa, pickly flavor. Like way over the top for me. I'm not a big pickle guy, okay? And it did not lose any pickleness in this cooking. For me, it doesn't need any more lemon juice and none of that. Nope. Now for me, the question next is, how do these mix together, right? So I went a little bit farther with this poached egg than maybe some people do, because I don't like a super runny poached egg. So this is a little bit more cooked. Still plenty of runniness here. Now, what happens when we get these two flavors together? Oh yeah. So, you know, the egg, unless it's got a lot of seasoning in there, it could be a little bland. And I think it mixes really well with what's going on with this pickle and the gravy and all this. So I think it tempers the cucumber really well. The two things really, they blend nicely. So this is like everything mixed together, isn't it? Fried pickle, that's like fair food, right? And then we got gravy, and then we have a poached egg. It's like none of these things go together, at least in our modern cooking. But here we've got them all coming together into this recipe, and you would think it would be some sort of really, really bad combination. And maybe that's why it's left out of history. Maybe that's why this isn't a common dish today. Maybe it's just a little too mixed up. But hey, I'd be willing to eat this again. This is what the channel is all about. This is what we do here. As we dig into a cookbook, we find something that doesn't fit. It's not what we do. And we walk in their shoes and make that food and try it out. We get to taste things they get to taste 200 years ago, and we get to try it all out again. It's lost. Not very many people probably get to try fried pickles in gravy with poached eggs on top, but we do.
Hello, I'm Ryan Kerr. I have two exciting recipes for you today, both from the same cookbook in 1755, and they're meatballs. One with meat, one without meat. I have no idea what they're gonna taste like, but I think they're gonna be yummy. Let's check them out. So I went into the cookbooks yesterday looking for a recipe to do today, and I was having a lot of trouble finding something that really jumped out at me. Sometimes it goes that way, but if you keep searching, you're gonna find something interesting, and that's what happened to me when I found this Elizabeth Cleland recipe from her New and Easy Method of Cookery, one of my favorite cookbooks from the time period, and I try to give it a little space before I use it again because I like to use it a lot. At any rate, there are these 2 meatball recipes. In fact, there are 3 right next to each other, but 2 of them are both called Another Way for a Forced Meatball. And that stood out to me. One of them had no meat at all, and one of them had meat. And they're almost identical in their process and in their ingredients. So I was like, man, that's really interesting that she's trying to give you an opportunity to have a really good meatball-like dish, even if you don't have any meat around. And that just popped out at me as something really fun to try. I have a show on our platform, Townsends Plus, called Unpacking the Pantry. And in that show, one of the things that I really like to do is find approachable recipes. And a lot of times I'll even go back to recipes that we've done on this channel in the past because folks are already familiar with them. But the whole idea is let's take everything that can be intimidating about cooking period food out of the equation and just get down to, okay, how do I make this in my kitchen at home? This recipe seems like it's perfect for that. So I wanted to bring that to the channel and let you guys experience a little bit of what that show is about. So let's go ahead and read these recipes. You can follow along at home. Again, it's a New and Easy Method of Cookery by Elizabeth Cleland. If you plan to make these, is a really good time to get a piece of paper and write down ingredients so you can run to the store. You might even have them at home. Another sort of forced meatballs. Crumb a penny loaf and add to it 8 ounces of butter or beef suet, minced very fine, lemon peel, parsley, and a bit of onion shred fine. Season it with pepper, salt, nutmeg. Wet it with 2 eggs, roll it into your hands to a paste. Then make in small balls the bigness of a nutmeg. Fry them in butter. So that's obviously the non-meat version of this recipe. And then the second one is also called Another Sort of Forced Meatballs. And I love that they both have the same title. Chop an equal quantity of any tender meat with beef or mutton suet, and the same quantity of crumbs of bread with lemon peel, parsley, and onion shred small. Season it with pepper, salt, nutmeg, and cloves. Wet it with eggs and work it up together, then roll it into small balls and fry them in butter. Very similar. The meat one has the addition of cloves. There's really not a whole lot different other than that. So this is what we're gonna do. For the non-meat version, it says we can use suet or butter. We're gonna use butter for that one because not everybody has suet at home or knows where they can get good suet. We carry suet at our store, so we always have a supply of that. So we use suet for the meat version. And then when we're done, we'll taste them together, see which one we like more, and maybe they'll both be just as good, and we'll just say, hey, here are 2 great options. So we started off with these big roasts of beef, and we cubed them up after putting them into strips, and then you just back and forth with your knife. You keep going until you have something that's almost like ground beef that you would buy in the store, or you might turn into a burger patty, or like I said earlier, a meatloaf. But this consistency is really good. This is what we want to start working on our meatballs. So one of the really interesting and kind of funny things about this recipe is that they even use a nutmeg as a size reference for what they want the meatball to be. So, like, we don't have a binder in here yet, but you can see that if we take this guy right here, we roll it up, that is, I don't think that that's, I mean, it's the right size, like a nutmeg, but I don't think that it is what we think of, or I normally think of, as a meatball. Especially if you're used to something like spaghetti and meatballs or something like that, or Swedish meatballs, they're not that size. So this is gonna be really interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing how it turns out. We have all of our ingredients prepped for our meatballs. This is the meatball that has meat included. We're gonna take our meat first. I almost grabbed the breadcrumbs, but I think we're gonna start off with maybe all of that. It's just to take the same quantity of breadcrumbs as you have meat. So we're gonna put about half of these in there, maybe a little bit less than half. And now we gotta get the suet in here because that is going to be one of the things that helps to bind this all together, as well as our egg. I'm gonna start mixing this together now. I'm gonna judge consistency as we go, and then we'll start to season it and make sure that we get onions and things like that in there. But right now, it is very dry, and I'm gonna have to get some eggs in here too. There's really not a whole lot that you can mess up right now. Just, you know, keep working it until it feels about right. You want it to be able to bind together when you form it in your hands. Like they said, almost kind of like a paste. This is really close. We're gonna use one more egg. If it goes a little too far, then we can always add more breadcrumbs. So we'll be all right. So I've got the consistency about where I want it. As you can see, you can form it pretty well at this point. We're gonna mix it together a little bit more, but I'm gonna go ahead and get the parsley and the lemons. And I don't know how much parsley I want. That's what I'm gonna start with. Some lemon peel. And our onions all in here. We're gonna mix that together. On this, I would add a little and then work it and then see where you wanna go from there. You can't, it's hard to take it out, but it's easy to put it in. All right, I have all of the ingredients except for the seasoning incorporated nicely. We're gonna add a little bit of salt, black pepper, and ground clove. I don't know what I was thinking, but if John was here, this wouldn't have happened. I forgot the nutmeg when I was putting the spices in, and we all know that we cannot forget the nutmeg in this kitchen. We have finished preparing our forced meatballs. Now it is time to make the no meat meatballs. And this recipe could not be easier. You're gonna start with 6 to 8 ounces of breadcrumbs. You're gonna add about the same amount of butter. At this point, you can really start incorporating that. I kind of like to start that way and just see how much breadcrumb and butter you can mix together before you start adding other ingredients. Obviously, you're gonna have to get to your eggs pretty soon though. And again, you can always add more breadcrumb if it seems a little too wet. You can add a little bit more butter or egg if it seems too dry. Right now, we're really dry. So we're gonna get an egg in there. And this recipe tells us right off the bat it's gonna take 2 eggs. So I'm gonna start with 2 eggs. And if I need more breadcrumbs, I'll get more breadcrumbs. They'll be all right. So once we kind of get this incorporated, we'll start adding our onions and lemon peel, parsley. But yeah, it's already starting to turn into something that's moldable. It certainly doesn't feel like the other version with that meat in there. It's kind of like, it's the butter's the only thing that's semi, you know, solid along in there with the breadcrumbs. So it feels like you're just mixing it a lot more, but we're getting there. We'll just kind of well that out real quick and add in our onion. And I'm just gonna go ahead and put all of this onion in because that's gonna be our main texture component now. And the parsley, I don't know. Well, you just kind of do that you just kind of eye it. And lemon peel gives you some acid, a little bit of aromatics, so you're gonna want that. And then I'm gonna mix this up and then I'll work into my salt and pepper and nutmeg. All right, I was making a mess anyway, so I decided to get rid of my bowl and do what I do at home and just mix it on a countertop. I think I'm gonna go ahead and add some more of this parsley just because I like that flavor. And there's not gonna be any meat in this, so I want as much aromatic herb, lemon peel, I want as much flavor as we can cram into this without having any meat. Give it some salt. Ooh. It's all right if you get too much in one spot because we're gonna mix it all together. Some pepper, and like I said, I like pepper. So there we go. And of course, nutmeg, and this time I didn't forget it. This is really just a lot like working a dough at this point. And if little pieces fall out as you're mixing it, then when you're done, you just kind of pick them back up. It's got a really similar consistency, you know. It still feels and looks like the other one did. And it's good to go. It's ready. I'm going to get some butter going in a pan. We're going to just kind of pull these off as we go. And I'm going to make sure to cook the ones without the meat first, so we don't have any of that meat flavor in them at all, because I want to know exactly what she wants us to taste here. What I have before me are beautiful meaty meatballs and non-meat meatballs. They both look wonderful. I am excited to try them. Here we go. This is a meat meatball with beef. That's good. Because the lemon peel in there is like, it's not there, and then pow! And it socks you right in the kisser, and it's right there. It's so good. It seems like a lot of breadcrumbs for a meat meatball. Like this is a good way to stretch your meat. So you're just like, okay, my supplies are running low, or hunting hasn't been going very well, whatever the situation may be. This is a way to get more meals out of that supply. So I like it, but it's a little breadcrumb heavy for my taste. The onion tastes good. The herbs come through. I think we spiced it right. The lemon is my favorite part. It's wonderful. Now, the non-meat meatball. The consistency is really similar. Like looking at them, I think that you can tell, but from afar you wouldn't be able to. This might be better. This is really good. It's like butter explosion, but you still have the onion, and you have the herb, and you have the lemon in this as well. I don't think the lemon sticks out as much, probably because there's more fat in this. There's a lot of butter in here. What it tastes like is a hush puppy. So if you've ever gone out for fish with your family and had a side of hush puppies, that's what this is, except it's a lot better. It's better than any hush puppy I've ever had. I'm not going to say that there's a winner here, because they're both really good. But if you do make hush puppies at home, this is your recipe. Do this instead. Whatever you're doing, scrap it. This is it. And this is a really great meatball. If I were going to make it at home, I would do less breadcrumbs. But if you want to taste what they're tasting in the 18th century, you need to make it the way that the book says at least once. It's really good that way. The last time I did an episode by myself on the YouTube channel, it was a deviled eggs recipe. And there was so much encouragement in the comments section of people saying that they went out and they tried that. And that's really great to hear. That's what we want you to do. We want you to take these flavors and aromas and go home and give them a try. There's nothing intimidating about this. This is easy stuff, and that recipe especially was, and so is this.
chicken, oysters, and lemon. That's what today's recipe has in it. It's called a fowl hashed. I can't wait to try this one. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. You know, I'm always looking for recipes, something from the 18th century that is similar to what we do today, but has a great 18th century twist on it. And that's what this recipe has. It pops right out of the cookbook when I'm reading through recipes, and I'm doing that all the time. This one's from The Lady's Assistant, Charlotte Mason. This is 1777, an English cookbook. It is chock full of great recipes. This is such a good cookbook, and I don't think many people know about it. This one is called a fowl hashed, which is a great term. So we can do this with any kind of bird, really. And it's really, really simple. It's cut it to pieces, put it into some gravy with a little cream, ketchup, or mushroom powder. They mean mushroom ketchup. Grated lemon peel, nutmeg, a few oysters, that was like, what, oysters? And their liquor, a piece of butter mixed with flour, keep it stirring till the butter is melted, lay sippets in the dish. There's a whole bunch of shorthand here, so we gotta really know what's going on with this recipe, because we can read it right off the bat if we just open it as a modern person and say, excuse me, that's not a recipe. A recipe starts with, you know, a cup of this and, you know, a pound of that, right? There's none of that in here. We have absolutely no measurements, and we don't even, if we don't understand the context here, we wouldn't even know what some of the ingredients really were. So you really have to be steeped in 18th century cooking to understand this recipe. But once you're used to these, you understand it right off the bat. A fowl hashed. So a hash is usually something in the 18th century time period where we chop up a bunch of stuff, a lot of times sort of leftover little pieces of things. It's not a you know, the first dish you would make from something. And we kind of stir it together and we cook it up. You know, today we're used to the term hash. We might get a hash in a can, really inexpensive dish. You know, that you would get. It's got some meat and it's got maybe potatoes, and it's all kind of diced up, probably even pre-cooked in the can. And then we just sort of heat it up and in a pan and serve it out, right? It's just really inexpensive. Probably the kids are going to complain about it. Maybe not. It's usually really salty and they don't mind at all. So this is really similar. When it says cut it to pieces, she means the fowl, and she means it's already cooked. So this is leftover fowl. We put it into some gravy. We're gonna be just using broth today. We've already got some thickening agents. We don't need a lot of liquid here. And we're gonna add a little cream. It says ketchup or mushroom powder. So we've got mushroom ketchup. This is gonna be great. Lemon peel, nutmeg, gotta have nutmeg, right? Oysters. What are oysters doing in here, right? So oysters are going to be great with their liquor, some butter mixed with flour, which is really, really typical in these recipes. And then, hey, we mix it all up in the pan, we heat it up, and we serve it on toast. This is going to be great. So we're supposed to be using some leftover fowl, in this case a chicken. And this bird is perfect. It's a tiny little bird by today's standards. Much more sized in an 18th century style. Today's chickens that we have are just giant. So, you know, this is the kind of chicken they would have had in the 18th century. Probably big for an 18th century chicken. Probably we would already be using a chicken that was deboned. You know, you use a little bit of the chicken for the supper, and then you debone what's left, and then you use it the next day when you're going to make a recipe like this one. So we're getting rid of all the bones, we're getting rid of all the cartilage. If we've got pieces of skin, hey, that's where so much of the flavor is at. I'm gonna make sure it's kind of broken up. We don't wanna get this big piece of skin in there when you're trying to eat it, so we wanna make sure it's in pieces as the recipe states. So our chicken is ready. We've got most of the ingredients ready. We can start cooking right away. But in the 18th century and in this kitchen, if we start this fire, before we need to, it's gonna fill this room up with smoke, or it's gonna be hot because it's summertime. So I wanna make sure all my ingredients are ready. So I'm even gonna get my lemon peel going here. And we're just getting some zest, really. It says a lemon peel grated. We don't want any of the white part of the lemon peel. Nasty. We just want the very, very outer layer. We can use a grater, or we can just shave off with our knife, or if you are a fancy person and you've got a zester, you can take off some zest. I love getting the zest off of lemon. Boy, it's just so aromatic, just so wonderful smelling, such a clean, nice smell. And people are, really concerned whether or not in an 18th century recipe, whether it's right to use lemons, lemon peel, orange, and they had access to all those things in the 18th century. A very common trade item, was not hard to get, might be expensive. So maybe you don't use a lot, or maybe you're very careful to have recipes all go together so that you use up all your lemon. Today, we might use half the lemon, toss the other half out, doesn't bother us at all. Lemons are inexpensive. In the 18th century, they were expensive, you used every bit. Now, what about our oysters? Here are the oysters. Should I do any prep work? The recipe doesn't give us any instruction on these oysters, cooked, uncooked. Again, it's a hash, so I'm guessing these are pre-cooked ingredients. So we've got our oysters, and they're bite-sized, so we're just gonna leave them just like this. And oysters really pop out of this recipe for me. We're here in Indiana, we don't have a lot of oysters in our cooking. They get mentioned in things like stuffing today, but we use them in almost nothing else. I'm not used to necessarily cooking with them, especially in this kind of a dish, but I think they're gonna add something special. I don't know what that is, right? Until we try it out. So what is going on with the butter and the flour? Well, this is sort of a proto-roux. We would, in recipes today, you would have this already pre-made up as a roux. And this is sort of the 18th century quick version of it. You take a ball of butter and you roll it in flour. It's bringing along just the right amount of flour, not a lot. So if you kind of do this in two separate steps, you might get too much here. So there we go. We have a ball of butter. Some of the recipes say something like, butter the size of a hen's egg or a turkey's egg if you're doing a really big one. This one, hen's egg, and we've rolled it in butter. So it's ready to go in the pan, so I don't have to do any extra prep as soon as it's hot. So this one cooked up really fast. All the ingredients are basically pre-cooked. So as they go in together, we're just sort of getting it up to heat so all the flavors can meld together. And we're letting that butter boil down and thicken up just a hair. Then it's done. We can serve this. We've served it up on toasts. I just cooked the toasts at the same time. And I can't wait to try it because it smells good, right? First off, the lemon is really there. Don't forget the lemon, the lemon peel in there, because it's really a thing that kind of sets it off. I'm gonna look for, that first bite. I couldn't detect a whole lot of the The oyster blended in with the chicken really well. I was kind of worried that the oyster juice that's supposed to go in there might throw off the flavor. No. The oysters really fit in there with the chicken very nicely. Those two flavors blended well together, much better than I expected. Let me just try the texture out. Oh, yeah, oyster's perfect in there. It really, even the texture turned out to be exactly like the chicken, not rubbery at all, just right in this recipe. And on toast, excellent. You can get that mushroom ketchup flavor. And if you want 18th century in the bottle, get a bottle of mushroom ketchup. Try it out. You can find it online. You can find it on our website. In this recipe, mushroom ketchup is perfect. I haven't added any spices in this. There weren't any in the recipe, right? No salt, no pepper. They expected some of those to come in with the pre-cooked items, and the mushroom ketchup kind of does it all. The only other spice we needed, nutmeg. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and I am joined today in the kitchen, special guest, Michael Dragoo. He has brought a fascinating recipe for us. It's shrimp sauce. It's not a sauce for shrimp, it's a sauce from shrimp. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Let us set the stage for this recipe because it's nuanced. There's more to it than just a simple recipe.
This comes from the English Art of Cookery, 1788. Take half a pint of picked shrimps, wash them clean, put them in a stew pan with a gill of gravy or water. Add half a pound of butter, some butter mixed with flour, a spoonful of anchovy liquor, 1 of ketchup, half a lemon. Boil till the butter is melted and is thick and smooth. Take the lemon out and squeeze the juice in, stir it about, and put it in a sauce boat.
So we've got some problems here when we read this initially. Okay, what's exactly going on here? The shrimp, that's easy, but we have a couple of concepts. One of them, they mention ketchup, right? Which isn't the ketchup that we would think of today. And then, of course, this idea of anchovy liquor. Okay, now what's going on here? We also have gravy, and these two things are actually going together. The gravy is drippings from meat, and the anchovy liquor is actually almost exactly the same thing. That's drippings from cooked fish, in this case, cooked anchovies. Today, anchovies don't come like that. We don't get fresh anchovies from the store and cook them. In the 18th century, they would have, and the liquor that came off of that, or the liquid that came off of that, that's what we would be using in this. So we're gonna have to interpret that a little bit in a modern sense.
The good gravy is, they just talk about a gravy or a good gravy over and over again in these recipes, and it's whatever meats you had drippings from with the addition of whatever root crops you had. In this case, I've got celery, I've got a part of a turnip, mushrooms, I've got some allspice in there, and there's some pork drippings, some beef drippings, and some bacon grease. That's what I put in there because that's what I had. And they would have done the same if they wanted something other than butter or the plain gravies dripping off the meat. Yeah. First thing we need to do is introduce our anchovy liquor, our good gravy, our mushroom ketchup, and our butter into the saucepan and bring it up to a simmer.
So this recipe has several different references to a spoonful, and that can be very confusing to us in our modern sense. You know, we've got a teaspoon specifically, or a tablespoon, and they're very standardized in the 18th century. Many times it just says a spoonful. Generally, we can guess that when it says a spoonful, it's something like a tablespoon. So we're gonna use a large spoonful in this recipe.
So what we're doing right now is we're adding some flour mixed into butter, just as much flour as we can pack into the butter. They weren't creating roux at the time like we're used to now. They were pushing butter and flour together and then adding that to their soup or stew or whatever. And we're also going to add this half a lemon. And at first we just put it face down and let it simmer along with the broth. And after we're done, we're going to squeeze it on top. And the last step is adding the shrimp. We just want to get them pink on each side. We don't want to overcook them. And once that's done, this dish is done. We're going to pull it off the fire, let it cool a little bit, and put it on a serving plate.
These look wonderful. Michael, so we have already cooked up, I mean, this is a sauce, right? So it needs to go on something. We cooked up a couple of steaks, but before we put the sauce on a steak, we should try it just like this.
Yep.
Go ahead.
All right, fingers in.
Yeah.
Here we go.
One for Michael, one for me. Superb.
Oh, I like these.
Very good.
I love these.
That sauce is great.
There's nothing to that sauce except I never would have used those ingredients if I were preparing shrimp.
Very, very good. Let's try
Wow.
it. Let's try it on steak.
Okay. I like that.
I really like it blended in with the steak. That adds a new level. As is all by itself, you know, it would be like, you know, the shrimp cooked in the butter, and then it's got some extra flavors in there. And there's definitely more flavor there than just shrimp cooked in butter. But it blends so well. It's a very smooth, you know, not separate notes.
I don't pick out
the meat is great.
I don't pick out the individual ingredients, but they're there. I mean,
right, and it's the you know in this one you might worry. It's like it's got anchovy liquor in there. It's got anchovy juice. No, I don't want that. No, it's perfect in this. So this is it. This is 18th century surf and turf. Excellent recipe, Michael. Thank you so much for bringing this.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for coming along with us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Boiled chicken is boring. But the problem is, in these 18th century cookbooks, that's all you find. Boiled chicken, boiled chicken. The only way to elevate boiled chicken is an amazing sauce. And that's what our recipe has. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Today's recipe comes from The Modern Art of Cookery Improved by Anne Shackelford. This is 1767. Let me read to you this recipe. It's called Chickens Boiled with Celery Sauce. Put 2 fine chickens into a saucepan to boil, and in the meantime prepare the sauce. Take the white part of 2 bunches of celery, cut about 1.5 inches long, boil it till it's tender. Then strain off the water and put it into a clean saucepan with 1/2 pint of cream and a piece of butter rolled in flour. Season with pepper and salt, set it over a clear fire, and keep it stirring. That's probably really important, till it is smooth and of a good thickness. Have ready 6 rashers of bacon, take up your chicken, pour your sauce into the dish with the rashers of bacon, and sliced lemon. That sounds great, doesn't it? It reminds me of some recipes that we cook at home. This is probably the best way to do this chicken. Now, normally, celery doesn't get me excited, but I think it's actually gonna go really well with this. Let's get started. Our chicken is already boiling in the pot. We're just gonna do one chicken. We're gonna do a half recipe. I've got celery here. We've already chopped off the very tops and the very bottom, cut it down into our 1.5 inches or a little bit less. We're just gonna add these to our cooking pot and add water to it to get a little above the top. Let's get it boiling. We've got our bacon pan. We just poured the extra grease out. And here's our celery. And we're just gonna toss that in. We might not need all of it, so I'm gonna save back a little bit. That looks good. And we have a cup of cream. And this is more than a cup, so that's a cup of cream. We also have our butter that's already been rolled in flour. So it's giving us sort of a pseudo roux here. Off it goes into the pan. We're gonna keep stirring this until it thickens up nicely. Once it gets almost there, then I'll add the bacon. Here it is. It looks really good. It plated well. And we're gonna add just a hair of salt and pepper. And we've already squeezed just a little bit of lemon on top. I didn't put the salt and pepper in while it was cooking. I thought it'd be better to try it out here in the tasting phase. And our boiled chicken is nice and soft. Let me get a piece of celery specifically, because that's the real question here. Everybody knows the bacon's gonna be good. There we go. Oh, all this goes together so well. You know, the sauce is so nice and creamy. I mean, we cooked it on that fire until it got just that right, thickness. It was really easy to do. Just cook it nice and slow. The bacon and the celery and the chicken go together with that creamy sauce, and that is a killer combination. This is very, very good. One of my favorite dishes that my wife makes is this amazing creamy carrots that's out of the French cookery book by Julia Child. And that creamy carrots recipe is just amazing. This creamy sauce that goes with these wonderfully tender carrots. And it very, very much reminds me of this sauce. But of course, we've added bacon and it's got celery along on top of that boiled chicken. It is the combination for this. This is very, very good. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today we're going to be baking something that you could use for a holiday treat so special. These are little tartlets right from the 18th century cookbooks. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So today's recipe comes from the lady's assistant, Charlotte Mason. And we've been using this cookbook a lot. It's a really a good cookbook. This one's from 1777, this particular edition. Tartlets. Have a very small and shallow tin pans, butter them, lay in a bit of puff paste, we'll talk about that later, marking it neatly around the edges, leave a hole in the middle, bake them. When they are cool, fill them with custard or put into each half an apricot, raspberry jam or other preserved fruit, a little preserved apple or marmalade, pour over it custard with a very little sugar in it. And also at the bottom here, icing for tarts. Beat the white of an egg, rub it on the tarts with a feather, sift over it double refined sugar. So we're gonna be making these very small little tartlets. Again, they're almost like hors d'oeuvres, right? They're just little single serving pieces, and that means we can have all kinds of fun. We can make all sorts of different types. Before we get started on our tart tins, before we start putting the paste in, let's talk about this paste for just a second. She calls for puff paste. And now today you and I can go to the grocery store and we can buy a box of puff paste. And in fact, I recommend it. It is great stuff. The problem is it's not the same puff paste that she's talking about in here. She actually has a direction for puff paste. Rub as much butter into some flour as possible without it feeling all greasy. It must be rubbed in quite fine. Put water in it to make it a nice light paste. Roll it out, stick bits of butter all over it, flour it, roll it up again. Do this 3 times. Today's puff paste probably has been, rolled over with layers, a dozen times or 20 times for all I know. It's made in a very industrial process and they can do it over and over and over again. Somebody in the 18th century who's making their own puff paste is not going to do that. So it doesn't have as many layers of butter and it doesn't puff up as much as today's puff paste. If we use today's puff paste in this little tin, it would crawl right out of the tin and it wouldn't be useful to us at all. So we're going to be using the short crust, and in the short crust recipe, she says this is the one that you will use for all tarts. So even though the tartlet recipe says use puff paste, in the short crust recipe, she says this is the one you want to use for all the tarts. So short crust is what we are going to use. So let's cut out some little circles a little bit bigger than our tart tin. Probably, I don't know, almost a ½ inch bigger than what that tart tin looks like. Because it's got to fold up and go down into the bottom. So we'll just start with this one to see how it works out before we get going too much farther. We're going to butter our tin first. And I'm going to be generous with that because we want these to pop right out so that we can serve them up. We're just going to sort of fold this up a little bit. I'll even get it into a kind of a cup shaped before I get started. Send that down in there. And I'm not going to worry that I have a little bit too much around the outside because this stuff shrinks down a lot, more than you might want. So I'm actually going to just flange the top of it almost out and leave that. There we go. So there, that one looks pretty good. We can bake this up before we put the contents in it. So we'll start with one like that. That was a good size. To hold this down, because we're baking these empty, we're gonna actually add some beans inside of here. Nice dry beans that we can pour out later. They'll help hold the shape. And then we're gonna try a little bit of this frosting before they go in the oven. A little bit of egg white that's been whipped up just enough to make it so it isn't stringy. And then we're gonna add a little bit of sugar to the top of that. So now they go right into the oven at 450 degrees for say 12 or 15 minutes. You'll need to watch them and see what they're doing in your oven. Now our recipe gives us all sorts of different ways we can put the fillings in, and she's really calling for sweetmeats of the time period. Some recipes would just say put sweetmeats in here. So we've got things like jams, marmalades, different kinds of dried fruit. So apricots she calls for, dates. You could use other ones at the same time. Any sweet item that you could put in here, and then to kind of balance that, you don't want just sweet. We've got the balance of the nice cool custard that's in there at the same time. And really, if you really want the last little beautiful sprinkle, you could put cinnamon on top, or even better, a little nutmeg sprinkled up on top, and they are beautiful. Let's go ahead and try one of these out. I've got one of these that has the glazing, it's got the custard on top, and then it's got a wonderful strawberry preserve underneath. Again, this is a perfect opportunity to use some preserves. Let's find out. I know, you're saying, oh, this is gonna taste horrible, John, right? The crust was perfect. Not baked too much. Again, wonderful sweetness of the preserves underneath. The amazing lightness of the custard up on top. They really go together well. Again, with a little bit of nutmeg. So good. Now, if you're interested in the pie crust, it's like, John, how did you make the crust? Go back to the apple pie episode we did just a few weeks ago. And I did just a very, very simple short crust for that. And for the custard, way back a year or two ago, we did a wonderful apple pie with a custard filling, almost exactly the same thing. So there we talk about the custard, so check that out. Whew, this one is really good and so beautiful and perfect for the holidays. You have guests over, you want to beautify your table, and you've got all these things. You can do these. They're so decorative as well as being so very wonderful.